They buried her alive. Not a metaphor, not an illusion. They locked her in the basement of their own house, bolted the iron door shut, and continued drinking wine upstairs while their own daughter slowly died at their feet. 11 months. And the only one who broke that door, not the police, not the law, but the Caldwell family's sworn enemy, a mob boss who came to destroy her family, a man who changed his plans just because he heard a faint knock from under the floorboards. This story is about what happened after that door opened. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far the story has progressed. Rain came down hard the night Damien Viscari crossed back into New York. Not a soft rain, not the kind that washed things clean. This was the kind that flooded gutters and turned headlights into blurs and made the whole city feel like it was dissolving at the edges. He sat in the back seat of the black SUV with his left arm resting on the door and watched Manhattan crawl past the tinted window without blinking. 6 years since he'd last seen this skyline. 6 years of building himself back from almost nothing. No territory, no money, no name that carried weight anymore. And now he was back in the city that had watched his father die in handcuffs. Back in the borough, where the Caldwells had laughed over his family's ruin, while federal agents sealed the doors of every Viscari business from the meatpacking district to the Upper East Side. He was not the same man who left. The scar beneath his ribs ached the way it always did in wet weather. 3 inches below the lowest rib on his right side, puckered and pale. A reminder of the night a Caldwell associate had put a bullet in him in a parking garage and left him on the concrete floor assuming he wouldn't make it to morning. He had crawled to his own car. He had driven himself to a man he trusted who wasn't a doctor but knew how to close a wound with what he had on hand. He had lain in a back room above a restaurant in Queens for 9 days, running a fever that should have killed him. He hadn't died. He had decided in those 9 days that death could wait. Death would have to come looking for him on his terms. And before it found him, every person who had put their signature on his family's destruction would understand exactly what they'd done. 5 minutes out, said the driver. Damien didn't respond. He was looking at a photograph he kept in his coat's interior pocket. Not from sentiment, but from precision. His father at 63, so gray at the temples. Hands that had built a criminal empire from a single numbers operation in the Bronx into a network spanning legitimate real estate, private ports, and half the city's pharmaceutical supply chain. Marcus Viscari had not been a good man in the way that the word good usually meant. He had killed when he needed to. He had made choices that kept his people safe and buried others in the process. But he had been loyal, and in the world Damien had grown up in, loyalty was the only currency worth more than blood. The Caldwells had taken that currency, spent it on federal immunity deals, and fed Marcus Viscari to the government like a lamb dressed in a suit. They had smiled at the funeral. Thomas Caldwell, patriarch, pillars of the community, 3-time charity gala host Thomas Caldwell, had stood 15 feet from Marcus's widow and expressed his condolences with the kind of practiced sincerity that comes from a lifetime of lying to people's faces. Damien had been 26 years old. He had shaken the man's hand because his mother was watching and he didn't want her to see what was already forming in his chest. Something that felt less like grief and more like stone. Cold and dense and permanent. 6 years. He had spent 3 of them rebuilding the Viscari network quietly through proxies and shell companies and men who understood that the work had to be invisible until it was ready to be loud. He had spent the other 3 making sure that when he returned to New York, the Caldwells were already weakened enough that the final blow would be surgical rather than messy. He didn't want a war. Wars were expensive and public, and they left bodies that created federal investigations. He wanted a collapse. The SUV slowed. Damien put the photograph away. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see the gates of the Caldwell estate in Westchester, 40 minutes north of Manhattan, but considered the family's formal home, the property that Thomas Caldwell's grandfather had built in the 1940s, and that had stood ever since as the physical monument to their dynasty. Black iron gates, stone walls, gravel drive lined with trees that were old enough to have witnessed things that never made it into any record. The intercom buzzed, words exchanged. The gates opened. Damien stepped out of the SUV into the rain without pulling his coat collar up. 2 of his men followed at a distance. He had told them to stay visible but peripheral. This was a business meeting, technically, and he intended to present it that way for as long as the pretense held. Thomas Caldwell met him at the front door, 71 years old and still broad across the shoulders, still wearing the kind of suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Silver hair combed back, hands steady, eyes that did the calculation that powerful men's eyes always did. Measuring threat, measuring leverage, deciding in the first 3 seconds whether you could be managed or whether you needed to be neutralized. "Damien," he said. "Thomas." No handshake this time. They both understood the meeting without needing to perform the ritual of it. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and something underneath that, something faintly damp, faintly chemical, like mildew that had been covered with furniture polish for so long that the two smells had merged into a single thing that no longer registered to people who lived inside it. Damien registered it. They sat in the library. Thomas poured scotch he didn't offer to share. On the walls, framed photographs, senators, governors, charity events, groundbreakings, the architecture of a reputation built over decades. Damien looked at them the way you look at something you're planning to demolish, not with hatred, but with the cool professional attention of someone mapping load-bearing walls. He laid out what he wanted in plain language. The Caldwells would transfer controlling interest in 3 of their commercial port operations that Damien's father had originally built and that had been absorbed into the Caldwell portfolio during the federal seizure 6 years ago. In exchange, Damien would allow the family to retain their real estate holdings and their political relationships, which would survive only if the Viscari organization chose not to expose the nature of how those relationships had been acquired. Thomas listened. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. "That's a significant ask," he said. "It's a reasonable settlement." "For whom?" "For everyone who wants this to be quiet." Thomas leaned back. He had the particular stillness of men who had survived many decades of dangerous negotiations by understanding when emotion was a liability. He looked at Damien the way you look at a predator through cage bars, with respect for the danger but confidence in the distance. "I'll need a week to speak with my attorneys." "You have 72 hours, Damien said. "After that, the nature of the conversation changes." He stood. The meeting was over. That was when he heard it. It was faint, barely audible beneath the sound of rain hitting the mansion's high windows. He almost dismissed it as the house settling, as pipes, as the percussion of an old building in a storm. But something in the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't random. It wasn't mechanical. It had the specific, uneven quality of something being produced by a living thing. 2 soft impacts, a pause, 2 more, the spacing of an organism that was exhausted but still trying. He stopped moving. Thomas watched him stop. "Something wrong?" Thomas asked. "What's that sound?" The old man's expression didn't change. His hands didn't move. But something happened behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, more like the quick recalibration of a man who had suddenly realized a variable he thought was controlled was no longer controlled. "Old pipes," Thomas said. "House this age, the plumbing makes noise, especially in weather like this." Damien looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking. "Of course," he said. He let his men escort him toward the front door. He put his coat on. He said nothing until he was outside, standing under the overhang while rain drummed the gravel, and then he turned to the man on his left, Victor, who had been with him for 4 years and who understood without needing things spelled out. "Side entrance," Damien said quietly. "Kitchen access if there is one. Go now." Oh. Victor was gone before Thomas Caldwell's footmen had closed the front door. Damien stood in the rain for 90 seconds. Then he walked back inside without knocking. The footman looked alarmed. "Sir, the meeting is concluded," Damien agreed. "I left something." He walked past the man before a response could form. Through the entrance hall, past the library where Thomas had risen from his chair, past the formal dining room with its long table and its chandelier that threw fractured light across everything, and into the hallway that ran toward the back of the house. He wasn't searching randomly. He was following the memory of where the sound had come from, the general direction of the floor beneath the west end of the library, which meant the lowest level of the house. Thomas appeared behind him. "This is not acceptable. Where's your wine cellar?" Damien said. It wasn't a question. "You need to leave this property before I have—" Damien turned and looked at him. Just looked. Whatever Thomas Caldwell was going to say completed itself in silence and then did not come out. The wine cellar door was at the end of a narrow hallway off the kitchen. Victor was already there, having come through the service entrance. He met Damien's eyes and gave a single nod toward the stairs descending into the dark. They went down together. The cellar was large and cold, and smelled of damp stone and old bottles. Industrial shelving held racks of wine that probably hadn't been touched in years. The Caldwells were many things, but Damien doubted they spent much time in their basement engaged in peaceful contemplation of their collection. At the far end of the cellar, behind a stacked wall of storage crates and two metal shelving units that had been positioned with just slightly too much deliberateness, there was a door, steel, flush-mounted in the stone wall. The kind of door that didn't belong in a wine cellar by any architectural logic Damien could identify. Chained shut with a padlock that was newer than anything else in the room. He stood in front of it and listened. The sound was louder here, still faint but no longer ambiguous. Two soft impacts. A pause. Two more. Something hitting the door from the inside with whatever force it had left, which wasn't much. Damien took the padlock in both hands. It was a good lock. Serious hardware, not decorative. He turned to Victor, who produced a bolt cutter from the bag he carried without being asked. The chain took 3 attempts. The links weren't designed to withstand that kind of force applied at a precise angle, and when the last one gave, the chain dropped to the stone floor with a sound that rang through the cellar like something being announced. The smell came before the door finished swinging open. Rot. The specific rot of enclosed space and human waste, and something organic decomposing in darkness. Mold. Beneath all of it, something sharper. The chemical smell of medications metabolized and sweated out. The ammonia undertone of a body that had been consuming itself for lack of adequate nutrition. Damien had been in war zones. He had been in places where people had died in rooms that were then closed for weeks. He had smelled things that required a person to consciously continue standing rather than stepping back. He was not a man who flinched at ugliness. He stood in the doorway and did not move for a moment. The room beyond was perhaps 8 feet by 10, concrete walls and floor, a single bulb in a wire cage on the ceiling that flickered at an irregular interval, producing light that was more like the suggestion of light. Enough to see shapes, not enough to see clearly. There was a cot against the far wall, a bucket in one corner, a small table with a plastic pitcher on it that appeared to be empty. On the floor beside the cot, not on it but beside it, curled on her side with her back against the cold concrete, was a woman. She was thin in the way that took months of deliberate deprivation to produce. Not slim, not lean, thin in the structural sense, the kind of thin where you could see the geometry of the body beneath the skin, the architecture of joints and bones pressing outward because the tissue surrounding them had diminished. Her hair was dark and lank and splayed across the floor. She was wearing what might have once been a cream-colored blouse and gray slacks, both of which had long since ceased to be recognizable as clothing and had become something closer to rags, thin and gray-stained and worn to translucency in places. Her wrists were bruised, not from restraints currently. There was nothing holding her in place, but from prior restraints and recently. The bruising was still fresh enough to be vivid, purple and yellow in the unsteady light. She had heard the chain drop. She had heard the door open. She was trying to push herself upright against the cot and not managing it, her arms shaking with the effort, her breath audible across the small room, shallow and rapid and wet at the edges in a way that meant her lungs weren't fully clear. She turned her head toward the doorway. Gray eyes, pale and very direct, even through the visible exhaustion, even through what must have been terror at the sound of the door. Eyes that had clearly spent a long time calculating threat in every stimulus, and that were doing so now, looking at Damien and at Victor behind him with the flat, desperate calculus of someone who had learned that hope was a thing that cost more than it was usually worth. Her lips were cracked, split at the corners, dry in the way that meant she hadn't had adequate water recently. Recently meaning days, not hours. She didn't scream. Damien noticed that. Most people would have screamed. She just looked at him. Then she said, in a voice that was barely a voice that had the quality of something that had been used very little for a very long time and had grown rough from disuse and from breathing recycled air in a sealed room, "I didn't steal from them." Damien crouched down. Not to appear less threatening. He wasn't sure he was capable of that, and he wasn't going to insult her by performing it, but because standing over her felt like the wrong geometry for what was happening. "I didn't steal from them," she said again. Her eyes were fixed on him. "Please, don't let them lock me back in." Behind Damien, he heard footsteps on the cellar stairs. Thomas Caldwell had followed. He heard the old man stop when he saw the open door. Damien turned and looked at Thomas Caldwell across the length of the cellar. Thomas's face was doing something complicated. There was no fear there. Or rather, the fear was beneath a layer of something harder, the habitual control of a man who had been managing other people's perceptions of him for so long that even genuine panic expressed itself as a kind of contained rigidity. "This is a private family matter," Thomas said. Damien stood up slowly. He looked at the woman on the floor. He looked at the bucket in the corner. He looked at the empty water pitcher and the bruises on her wrists and the way her ribs moved when she breathed, working too hard for air that should have required no effort at all. He looked at Thomas. "Victor," he said. "Yeah." "Call the car, and call Mira." This was the physician he kept on retainer, a woman who asked no questions and filed no reports. "Tell her I need her at the Midtown address. Tell her it's priority, and she should bring what she'd need for someone who hasn't eaten properly in several months." "Got it." "And Victor?" "Yeah." Nobody comes down these stairs. He heard Victor move to enforce that. He heard Thomas begin to object and then stop when Victor's hand came down on his shoulder. Damien turned back to the room. He crossed to the woman on the floor and crouched again, this time closer. Up close, the smell was worse, but he ignored it the way he had trained himself to ignore things that were not relevant to the immediate situation. "Can you tell me your name?" he said. She was watching him with those gray eyes, still calculating, still frightened. But something had shifted slightly. The fear had moved an inch to make room for something she probably hadn't felt in a long time, which was uncertainty about whether the situation was entirely bad. "Serafina," she said. He didn't react. He wasn't sure yet what he was dealing with. Couldn't know, in this moment, who she was in relation to this family, or why she was here, or what the full shape of the thing was. That would come. Right now, the only relevant fact was what he could observe, which was that a human being had been locked in a room until she could barely sit upright. "Okay," he said. "I'm going to help you stand. Is there anything broken? Any injuries to your legs?" She considered this with the seriousness of someone who had learned to inventory her own body carefully, to know exactly what was wrong because wrong things in here meant nothing could be done, but the knowing was still better than not knowing. "My right ankle," she said. "I fell. A few weeks ago." "Okay." He moved to her left side. "Put your arm across my shoulders." She hesitated. He watched her do the math. Yeah, man she doesn't know, touching her, in a place where touch had only ever meant something bad. He waited. He didn't push. Then she put her arm across his shoulders. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. That was the thing that hit him. Not her face, not her eyes, not the specific texture of the situation. It was the weight of her, or the absence of it, the way a person feels when they've been systematically diminished for months until they are architecturally still themselves, but substantively hollow. He carried her toward the door. "Don't look back," he said. She didn't. She pressed her face against his coat and breathed. Short, careful breaths, and didn't look back at the room where she had spent 11 months learning what being erased by your own family felt like. Upstairs, Thomas Caldwell was standing in the kitchen hallway with Victor behind him. 2 more of Damien's men had come in from outside. Thomas watched Damien come up from the cellar carrying his youngest daughter, and his face. Damien watched it carefully, cataloging. His face showed many things, but the one it did not show was surprise. He had known she was down there. He had known for 11 months. "Thomas," Damien said. The old man said nothing. "We'll speak again," Damien told him, "sooner than 72 hours." He carried Serafina through the kitchen and out through the service door into the rain. His men had brought the car around to the side. He got her into the back seat and settled against the seat and pulled his coat off and put it over her because she was shaking and the car would take a few minutes to warm up. She was looking at the ceiling of the car. Her lips were moving slightly, like she was counting or running through something in her head, one of those rituals people develop in confined spaces to mark time and maintain the boundary between their inner world and the one that's trying to erase them. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere safe." "I don't know what that means." "I know," he said. "You'll figure it out." The car moved. The Caldwell estate receded in the rearview mirror, its stone walls and iron gates and old trees and its secrets, one of which was no longer a secret, becoming smaller in the distance. Damien Vescari sat in the back seat of the car next to the woman he had pulled from the floor of a basement room, and for the first time in 6 years, the clean, cold architecture of his plan for the Caldwell family felt complicated in a way it hadn't felt before. He looked at her. She was already asleep, or close to it. Her eyes were closed and her breathing had slowed, though it still had that wet, careful quality that Mira was going to need to assess. In sleep, with the tension of immediate terror releasing slightly, her face was younger than it had seemed in the cellar. She couldn't be more than mid-20s. Serafina. He turned her name over in his head and then turned over the question that had arrived with it. The question he hadn't let himself ask yet, hadn't permitted to form fully because in the cellar, the forming of it wasn't the priority. The name Serafina had not been in any of the intelligence he had assembled on the Caldwell family in the 18 months of preparation for his return to New York. He knew Thomas's sons, Elias, 43, the eldest, who ran the family's public-facing operations and who had cultivated a reputation in civic circles that was almost entirely fictional. Ronan, 38, who handled the financial architecture of the family's less visible interests. And Cole, 34, the youngest son, who functioned primarily as the family's enforcement mechanism when enforcement was required. 3 sons. No daughters, according to everything he had assembled. He looked at the sleeping woman in his coat. Serafina. A daughter who didn't exist in any record Damien had seen. No social media footprint, no photographs at family events, no college enrollment, no professional records, no public life of any kind going back. He tried to think. Going back at least 5 or 6 years, probably longer. The kind of absence that happened either because a person had chosen it or because a person had been made to disappear from the record by people with the resources and the motive to do so. He looked out the window at the highway. Rain hammered the glass. The Caldwells had kept a daughter in a basement for 11 months. That fact was sitting in him like a stone in standing water, changing the temperature of everything around it. He had come to New York to dismantle a criminal family that had betrayed his father. He had come with a plan that was clean and surgical and designed to avoid complications. He had come prepared for many variables and contingencies. He had not come prepared for a gray-eyed woman who weighed nothing and had said, "Please don't let them lock me back in," with the flat, exhausted dignity of someone who had learned that begging didn't work but couldn't stop trying because stopping entirely meant something she wasn't willing to accept. When the car reached the entrance to the city, she opened her eyes. She looked at him directly, fully awake, just like that. The kind of instant wakefulness that you developed when you couldn't afford to be caught in that soft intermediate state, when sleeping somewhere unsafe meant training your nervous system to resurface quickly, no matter how deep the exhaustion. "You're Damien Vescari," she said. He looked at her. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was still rough, still barely there, but there was something in it that hadn't been there in the cellar. Something harder. "I know why you came to that house tonight, and I know it wasn't to help me." He said nothing. "So," she said, "what do you want from me?" The car moved through the wet city. Somewhere to the north, behind them, the Caldwell estate stood in the rain, and inside it, Thomas Caldwell was already making phone calls. Damien could feel it with the certainty of long experience, the certainty of a man who had watched many powerful people in crisis and knew exactly what they did when the walls started closing in. What they did was come out fighting. And what they would do now, what Thomas would make happen within hours, maybe less, was reframe everything. Reframe Serafina, reframe Damien, turn the story of a woman found starving in a basement into something else entirely, something that served the family's survival rather than threatening it. They had the resources, they had the relationships, they had decades of practice at making inconvenient truths into manageable narratives. Damien looked at Serafina Caldwell, who was apparently a Caldwell, apparently the hidden one, apparently the one they had put in the ground, rather than in a courtroom or a hospital or anywhere that would have allowed her to remain in the world as a person with rights and a voice. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him with those gray eyes. "Not yet," he added. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, Manhattan's light smeared through the rain-covered windows, the whole city dissolving and reforming, dissolving and reforming, in the way cities did in weather like this, beautiful and cold and entirely indifferent to the question of who deserved what. Then she looked away. But her hands, he noticed, had stopped shaking. Not because she trusted him. He didn't think she trusted anything that was still alive and mobile and capable of making decisions about her. The shaking had stopped because she had run the numbers in whatever internal accounting system she'd built to survive 11 months alone in a dark room, and the numbers had told her that she was, at minimum, no longer in the worst situation she'd been in recently. That was not comfort, but it was something. Damien looked out the window. He had 6 years of a plan behind him, and somewhere in the wet dark of the city, a family that was about to make his next move very complicated, and in the seat beside him, an unknown variable wearing his coat. The car drove on. The penthouse on 54th Street was the kind of place that didn't appear in any listing. No doorman who used last names, no concierge who asked questions, no neighbors who made eye contact in the elevator. Damien kept 3 properties in Manhattan under names that didn't connect to him through any searchable record, and this one he used for situations that required discretion at a level that most of his operations never demanded. He hadn't anticipated needing it this soon. Mira Vasek arrived 40 minutes after the car. She was 51, small, gray-haired, and moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades doing important work in rooms where the less visible she made herself, the better. She had been treating Damien's people for 11 years, and in that time, she had learned to ask exactly the questions that were relevant to treatment and none that weren't. She took one look at Serafina in the penthouse entry and said, "How long?" 11 months minimum, Damien said. "Possibly longer intervals before that. I don't know the full history yet." Mira nodded once and moved toward the woman on the couch. Serafina had said nothing in the elevator, and nothing in the walk from the elevator to the couch, where she had sat with Damien's coat still around her shoulders, and her eyes moving carefully around the room in the systematic way of someone mapping exits and threats and calculating the distance between where she was and any door. "I'm a doctor," Mira said to her, not softly, not with the performed gentleness of people who thought vulnerability required a specific register, just plainly. "I'm going to check your vitals and assess what you need. You can tell me to stop at any point." Serafina looked at her, then at Damien, who had moved to the far end of the room and stood with his back to the window, giving her the space of the room between them. "Okay," Serafina said. Damien turned and looked out at the city while Mira worked. Rain still falling, the streets below reflecting light in long, broken streaks. He could see the dark gap of Central Park to the north, and beyond it, the residential towers of the Upper West Side, and somewhere further north than that, the highway that led back to Westchester, where Thomas Caldwell was currently doing exactly what Damien had predicted he would be doing. His phone had already received 3 calls he hadn't answered, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, new numbers, burners or proxies, and 1 from Elias Caldwell's direct line, which Damien had acquired 18 months ago through means that Elias was unaware of. He let them ring. Behind him, he heard Mira's voice in its low, clinical cadence, and Serafina answering in the rough near whisper that seemed to be the maximum her voice could currently produce. He heard numbers, blood pressure, pulse, the measurements that turned a human condition into a language that could be addressed. "Severe malnutrition," Mira said eventually, not lowering her voice, addressing Damien directly. "Dehydration. The ankle is a stress fracture, not fully healed and probably re-injured from limited movement in an enclosed space. There's evidence of prior rib fractures that weren't treated, 2, maybe 3, healed improperly. She needs IV fluids tonight, a specific refeeding protocol for the nutrition, and imaging on the ankle and ribs when she's stable enough to move. She's not going to a hospital." The last sentence was not a question. "No," Damien said. "Then you need to get me equipment here. I'll give you a list. Victor will handle it." He turned back to the room. Serafina was sitting with her wrist extended, letting Mira record something, and she was looking at him with an expression that he was beginning to understand was her default. Not hostile, exactly, but stripped of anything conciliatory. The expression of someone who had decided a long time ago that performing comfort for other people's benefit was a resource she couldn't afford. He respected it. He also needed to know what she knew, and how much of it was going to complicate the next 72 hours. He waited until Mira had finished the immediate assessment and had stepped into the kitchen to call her supplier for the equipment. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the couch. Not close, but close enough that they didn't have to raise their voices, which seemed like a consideration worth making given the state of hers. "Tell me about the 11 months, he said. She looked at him. "Not the experience," he said. "The reason. What did you do that they needed to bury you?" Something moved across her face. Not pain. She'd moved past the register where events caused that direct, immediate expression. More like the recognition of a question she had answered in her own head so many times that the answering of it had worn grooves in her, had become less like memory and more like topography. "I found the ledgers," she said. He waited. "My father keeps paper records, old habit. His father did it, he does it. The digital architecture is for appearances. The real accounting is in physical books that go back to the 1980s. She paused, swallowed with visible effort. He stood up without comment, went to the kitchen counter, and brought back a glass of water. She took it and drank carefully, slowly, the discipline of someone who had learned that drinking too fast when you were dehydrated made you sick. "I found them by accident. I was looking for something else, estate documents, because I had reason to believe the family was restructuring assets without disclosing it to the 2 minority shareholders who had rights under my grandfather's original trust. I was going to consult an attorney. And the ledgers showed something else. The ledgers showed everything." Her voice was flat, not dramatic, just precise. "Every cartel payment going back 22 years, the pass-through accounts, the charity vehicles, 3 of them, all children's foundations, all used to launder between 4 and 9 million annually depending on the year. Names of officials who were paid to look the other direction. Names of people who weren't paid and who had other arrangements made for them instead." "Other arrangements," Damien said. She met his eyes. "People who died in ways that were officially accidental." The room was quiet. From the kitchen, the low sound of Mira on the phone. "How many people have seen those ledgers?" Damien said. "Before me. My father and Elias. Possibly Ronan, but I'm not certain. Ronan handles the digital side, and I think my father kept the paper records separate deliberately." She held the glass of water in both hands and looked down at it. "I made copies before they found out I'd seen them. I had 4 days between when I found them and when my father confronted me. I used those 4 days. Damien looked at her steadily. "The copies are where?" "Not in that house," she said, "and not somewhere they've found. They looked. The first 2 months they were still asking me where. After that they stopped asking, which I think means they decided I was either dead or that the copies would surface eventually and they'd manage it when they did." She looked up at him. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you're going to ask me eventually, and because I don't have the energy for the longer version of this conversation where I pretend I don't know what you're thinking." "What am I thinking?" "You're thinking those ledgers might be useful to you." No inflection, not accusatory, not resigned, just stated. He held her gaze. "Yes." "Okay," she said. He waited for more. There wasn't any more. She drank her water and he sat with the word "okay" and what it meant coming from someone who had spent 11 months in a concrete room and whose entire orientation toward the world had been stripped down to the functional minimum. The word "okay," meaning not "I agree with you" or "I trust you," but simply "I understand the shape of this situation and I am still here." He stood up. "You'll sleep here tonight. There are 2 bedrooms. Take whichever. Victor will stay in the hall. He won't come in." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to give you accurate information," he said. "Feel however you need to feel." He moved toward the door. "Viscari." He stopped. "Why did you go back in?" she said. "After the meeting. You were leaving. You heard that sound and you went back in." "Why?" He thought about the question. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it, because the honest answer was not the simple one. I didn't like the way he said old pipes, Damien said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she lay down on the couch with his coat over her and closed her eyes. He left. In the hallway, Victor was already there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the particular stillness of a man who was always waiting and had made peace with that condition. The Caldwells have been busy, Victor said quietly. How busy? Elias put out a statement 40 minutes ago. Social media, then picked up by 2 news outlets, says Serafina is a person with a documented history of mental illness who has been under the care of a private treatment facility and that there are concerns about her safety following what they're calling an unauthorized removal from her care environment. Damien absorbed this without expression. They're framing it as an abduction. They're trying to. The facility. Is there an actual facility? There's a paper trail, Victor said, clean enough to survive a first look, which means they prepared this. This wasn't improvised tonight. They had this ready. Damien moved to the window at the end of the hallway, the city below. The rain still falling, lighter now, the storm exhausting itself. 11 months. They'd had 11 months to build the alternative story. Medical records, institutional correspondence, probably photographs. The infrastructure of a lie that would make Serafina's account sound like the product of a disturbed mind rather than a person who had survived something real. Get me Lorne, he said. Lorne was his attorney. The legitimate one, or the one that existed to interface with legitimate systems, which was not quite the same thing but was close enough for current purposes. Tonight? Now. Victor pulled out his phone. Damien stood at the window and thought about the ledgers. About copies that existed somewhere in the city. About a woman on the other side of the wall who had memorized every dimension of a concrete room and who had, in the 4 days between discovery and imprisonment, thought carefully enough to make backups before they could be taken from her. She was not fragile. The physical condition was catastrophic and would take months to repair. But the person inside the physical condition, the one that had survived 11 months with her faculties intact, and her secrets intact and her defiance intact, the one that had looked at him in the back of the car and asked, "What do you want from me?" with the directness of someone who had stopped pretending that power differentials were polite. That person was not fragile. That person was, he thought, going to be very complicated. Lorne arrived at the penthouse at 1 a.m. with a briefcase and the particular expression of a man who had received many middle-of-the-night calls in his career and had developed a face for it. Professionally concerned, personally neutral. They sat in the kitchen while Mira worked in the background on the equipment Victor had arranged, and Serafina slept. Damien laid it out. Not all of it. He gave Lorne what Lorne needed and not what he didn't. A woman found in conditions consistent with unlawful imprisonment, medical documentation currently being established by a physician, the family's preemptive media framing. The question of what leverage existed to manage the next 48 hours without making the situation more public than it needed to be. Lorne listened without interrupting. He had a yellow legal pad and he wrote on it in the shorthand Damien had never been able to decode but had learned to trust. The medical documentation is the core, Lorne said when Damien finished. If the physician can generate a contemporaneous record of the physical findings, malnutrition, the fractures, signs of prolonged confinement, that's the foundation everything else builds on. The family's facility documentation is the problem. They'll have judges and institutional contacts who can give that paper weight. How quickly can we challenge it? With the right resources. I can have a filing that forces disclosure of the facility's actual patient records in 3 days, 4 if they fight the service. But Damien, Lorne set down his pen. This goes public the moment we file. There's no version of this that stays quiet once we're in the legal system. Damien was quiet. Is that a problem? Lorne asked. I haven't decided yet. The alternative is informal, pressure, negotiation, but given that they've already put the statement out, the window for that is probably closing, Damien said. I know. Lorne left at 2:30 with instructions to prepare the filing and hold it pending Damien's authorization. Damien sat alone in the kitchen for a while after that. Mira had set up an IV in the bedroom. Serafina had apparently woken, allowed it, and gone back to sleep. The apartment was quiet. The rain had stopped. He was thinking about what Victor had said. This wasn't improvised tonight. They had this ready. The Caldwells had kept a prepared contingency for the possibility that Serafina escaped or was found. That was what the facility documentation meant. It wasn't panic, it was a system. They had anticipated this moment and built infrastructure around it, which meant they were more afraid of what she knew than they had ever let appear. He thought about the ledgers. Then he did something he hadn't planned to do before morning, which was go to the bedroom door and knock. A pause. Then, yeah. He opened the door 3 inches. She was awake, sitting up against the headboard with the IV line running to her arm and the lamp on the nightstand turned to its lowest setting. She looked at him with the immediate focus of someone who hadn't really been sleeping so much as waiting. Elias put out a statement, he said. An hour ago. They're calling you a mental health patient who was removed from care without authorization. She said nothing. They had it prepared. Facility documentation, the framework. They've been building it. I know, she said. He looked at her. I always knew they would, she said. If I ever got out. That was always going to be the play. Make it so that anything I said sounded like symptoms rather than testimony. Her voice was still rough but stronger than it had been. The IV was working. That's why I made 3 copies, not 1, 3, in 3 separate locations, because I knew that if they ever found me, the first thing they'd do is construct the version of me that nobody would believe. Where are they? He said. She held his gaze. I need to think about that, she said. We don't have a lot of time to think. I've had 11 months to think, she said. I know how to do it quickly. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded and pulled the door back to 3 inches. Viscari. He stopped. I know what those ledgers mean to you, she said. I know it's not just about what happened to me. I know you want them because of what's in them about your family. He was very still. My father testified against Marcus Viscari, she said. I know that. It's in the ledgers. Not because it was a separate entry, but because the federal immunity arrangement is documented in the same accounting as everything else. Every favor, every arrangement, every exchange, it's all the same book. The silence in the room was very specific, the kind that had weight to it. So we both want the same thing, she said, just for different reasons. He looked at her across the low light of the room. Sleep, he said. He closed the door. In the hallway, he stood for a moment with his hand against the wall and thought about what she had just told him. Not the ledgers. He had assumed something like the ledgers would exist. What he was thinking about was that she had told him, voluntarily, without being pushed. She had handed him the one piece of information that gave her leverage, and she had handed it without negotiation, without a demand attached, without extracting a guarantee first. Either she was more desperate than she was letting on, or she was smarter than he had yet fully accounted for. He went to the living room and sat down and didn't sleep. By 6 in the morning, the Caldwell statement had been picked up by 4 news outlets and was being circulated with a photograph. Serafina at what appeared to be a medical facility, wearing clothes he didn't recognize, looking at the camera with an expression that in this context read as bewildered, which was presumably the intended effect. He studied the photograph carefully. The date stamp was from 8 months ago. The facility in the background had no visible identifying details. It could have been taken anywhere. Victor brought him coffee without being asked. Elias called again, Victor said. And there's a federal contact reach out. Agent named Caraway. Missing persons inquiry preliminary stage, probably pushed by the family, but they put it through official channels to give it weight. Damien drank his coffee. Who's Caraway? Field agent. Not someone on anybody's payroll that I know of. A real one. Looks like. He thought about that. The Caldwells bringing in a legitimate federal inquiry was either desperation or calculation. It could be used to legitimize their narrative, but it also opened doors that they couldn't control the way they could control their purchased relationships. Don't respond to Caraway yet, he said. I want Mira's documentation completed first. Victor nodded. And I want to know who's been to that estate in the last 24 hours. Not just Caldwell family, anyone. Attorneys, political contacts, anyone who arrived after I left. I have someone in the area. Use them. By 8 o'clock, Serafina was awake and sitting at the kitchen table eating small quantities of food with the careful attention of someone whose body was making insistent claims on her consciousness, but who understood that answering those claims too aggressively would backfire. Mira had given her a protocol: specific foods, specific amounts, specific intervals, and she was following it with the same precision she seemed to apply to everything. Damien sat across from her with the 2 morning papers and his phone. "They used a photograph from 8 months ago," he said, "which means they had access to you 8 months ago. You were in that room for 11 months. Where were you in the first 3? She looked up from her food. "They moved me," she said. "In the beginning, they kept me in a different location, a property in Connecticut, private, medical staff on site. I think they genuinely weren't sure in the first weeks what they were going to do, whether they were going to keep me isolated long-term or find another solution." She paused. Then Elias decided. Decided what? That I wasn't going to change my mind, that I would never agree to give them the copies or sign the documents they wanted me to sign, retracting my account, consenting to a narrative that I'd had some kind of breakdown. He decided the Connecticut arrangement was too expensive and too exposed. She held her coffee cup in both hands. "They moved me to Westchester in the 3rd month. I didn't know where I was for the first week. I figured it out by counting how long the drive was and what direction the light came through the ventilation." He looked at her. "The Connecticut property, Samam," he said. "Is that where the photograph was taken?" "Yes." "So there are staff, people who were there, who worked at that location, who saw you during those first 3 months." She looked at him steadily. "If you're thinking of using them as witnesses, they were paid." "Very well. And the documentation they signed would characterize their work as legitimate psychiatric care." "Witnesses can be motivated in different directions," Damien said. "I know." She set her cup down. "You should know that 2 of the staff treated me decently. I don't want them damaged." He looked at her. "That's a consideration I'll register," he said. "It's a condition," she said, "not a request." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. They sat for another minute in the particular quiet of 2 people who are calculating in parallel, who understand that they are each in possession of something the other needs, and that the terms of exchange are still being negotiated, even if no one is currently negotiating them out loud. Then Victor appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that Damien recognized as the specific look Victor wore when something had happened that was going to require immediate attention. "What?" Damien said. "Ronan Caldwell," Victor said. "He walked into the 20th precinct 40 minutes ago. He's giving a statement to federal agents, Caraway's people." Victor paused. "He's not backing the family story. He's talking." The kitchen went very quiet. Serafina set down her fork. Damien looked at Victor. "About what?" "About everything," Victor said. "He's been in there 40 minutes, and they're still going. Whatever he brought with him, it wasn't small." Damien looked at Serafina. She was looking back at him, and something had shifted in her expression. Not surprise, which told him she had considered this possibility and had her own read on her brother that she hadn't shared. What was in her face was something more complicated. The particular expression of someone who is watching a thing they set in motion a long time ago beginning to move, and who is not sure yet whether the direction it's moving is the one they needed. "Ronan," Damien said to her, "did you contact him before they put you in that room?" She looked at him without answering. "Serafina." "I left him a letter," she said, "before I made the copies, before I knew how bad it was going to get. I told him what I'd found, and I told him that if something happened to me, he would need to make a choice." Her voice was very even. "I didn't know if he'd make it. I didn't know if he had enough decency left, or if they'd gotten to it already. And now he's in a federal building talking to agents." "Yes." "With what?" Damien said. "What did he have access to that would make a 40-minute conversation worth having?" She was quiet for a moment. "Ronan runs the digital architecture," she said. "I told you that. What I didn't tell you is that 11 months ago, before they locked me up, Ronan was the one who drove me to the Connecticut facility. He was the one who helped them do it." Her jaw was tight. "And he has been living with that for 11 months. Damien looked at her. "The digital records," he said. "If he decided to talk," she said, "he would bring everything. That's who Ronan is. He either does nothing or he does it completely. There's no middle. She looked down at the table. I spent 11 months hoping he'd make the right choice and hating him for being the reason I needed to hope for it in the first place. Damien stood up. Everything about the next 12 hours had just changed. Ronan Caldwell in a federal building with digital records and 11 months of guilt on his conscience meant that the Caldwell family's prepared narrative, the facility, the mental health framing, all of it, was now under pressure from inside the family itself, which meant Thomas and Elias would know within the hour, if they didn't know already, that their containment had failed on a second front, which meant they would stop managing the situation and start burning it. Get the car, Damien said to Victor. Where are we going? I need to see Lorne. File the motion. Now. Not when I authorize it. Now. Victor moved. Damien turned back to Serafina. She was watching him with those gray eyes. The expression on her face, not quite the calculating look he'd been reading since the cellar. Something slightly different now. Something with more texture. Like the careful unfolding of a person who has been holding themselves at absolute minimum for so long that the possibility of something changing has arrived before they were quite ready for it. The copies, he said. I need one of them today. Before Thomas finds out what Ronan is doing and moves to... I know, she said. Tell me where. She looked at him for a long moment. There's a storage unit in Greenpoint, she said. Unit 14. The key is in a bank envelope at a branch in Midtown. Chase on 47th Street, safe deposit box registered to a name that isn't mine. She recited the box number. The key to that is... She reached up to her neck and pulled at something beneath the collar of the clean shirt Mira had found for her. A thin chain, and on it a small key. Hospital style, generic, the kind used for thousands of safe deposit boxes in 100 banks. She had been wearing it for 11 months, and no one had found it. Either because they hadn't thought to look, or because they had at some point decided it didn't matter. She held it out to him. He didn't take it immediately. You're giving me this, he said. I'm giving you half of it, she said. You have the key. The box number you'll remember. The name on the box. I haven't told you yet. He looked at her. When I'm ready, she said. When I know that what we're doing with those ledgers is something I've agreed to and not something that's being done around me. He held her gaze. The key sat in her palm between them. Then he reached out and took it. Fair, he said. He was at the door when his phone rang. The number was Elias Caldwell's line. He looked at it. He let it ring once more, then answered. Silence on the other end for 1 second. Then Elias's voice, and his voice had a quality that Damien had never heard in it before in any of the recorded conversations he'd studied in the 18 months of preparation. It was still controlled, but beneath the control something had cracked and was leaking through, something hot and pressurized that a lifetime of practice management hadn't fully been able to cap. You have my sister, Elias said. I found your sister, Damien said. There's a difference. Bring her back. No. Damien, the name used like a tool. You don't understand what she's told you. You don't understand what she... Elias. What? I'm filing in 2 hours, Damien said. Whatever you're planning to do in those 2 hours, I would consider carefully. He ended the call. He stood in the penthouse hallway with the small key in his pocket and the sound of Elias Caldwell's controlled panic still sharp in the air around him. There were things in motion now that were going to move whether or not any one person was driving them. Ronan in the federal building. The filing Lorne was preparing. The medical documentation Mira was finalizing. The Caldwell family, somewhere in this city or in Westchester, understanding for the first time that the lid they had kept on everything for 11 months was no longer on. Damien had come to New York with a plan. The plan was now something else. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting. And somewhere behind him in the kitchen, Serafina Caldwell was sitting at the table with both hands around a coffee cup. And she was, for the first time in 11 months, the elevator doors closed on Damien's reflection, coat, jaw, the small line of tension running from his left ear to his collar that only appeared when he was managing more variables than he'd planned for. And he rode down to the lobby and walked to the car and sat in the back seat and said nothing to Victor for 4 blocks. Then he said, What do we know about Ronan's timeline? He walked in at 7:42, Victor said from the front seat. Alone. No attorney visible, which means either he didn't want one or he made the call before he thought about it hard enough to lawyer up first. A man who walks into a federal building without a lawyer is either very stupid or very done, Damien said. Ronan Caldwell is not stupid. No. He looked out the window. Morning traffic, the specific density of Manhattan at 8:15, the city running its metabolism regardless. He thought about what Serafina had said. He either does nothing or he does it completely. 11 months she had been in that room with Ronan's choice hanging over her, and she had used the word decency when she talked about whether he had any left, and the word hating when she talked about what she felt for him. And both words in the same sentence had told him something about the particular exhaustion of loving and not forgiving someone at the same time. The filing took 40 minutes. Lauren had the paperwork ready and needed only Damien's authorization and 2 signatures, which Damien gave in a conference room on the 31st floor of a building on Lexington that smelled of carpet adhesive and recycled air. Once this is in, Lauren said, setting the pen on the table, the family will have their response in within hours. Their attorneys are good. Better than you? Lauren looked at him. Differently resourced, he said. They have relationships I don't have, judges who owe them things. That's not legal skill, that's infrastructure. It will slow us down. How much? 2-3 days, maybe more depending on which courtroom it lands in. Lauren collected the pages with the careful attention of a man for whom paper was still the primary medium of reality. The medical documentation is the anchor, Damien. If Mira's report is thorough and contemporaneous, and if she's willing to testify, she'll testify. Then we have something to stand on. He paused. But I want to be clear about what this is going to look like publicly. Once we file, this is news, not the 4th page. The front. Damien looked at him. I understand that, he said. And the optics of Damien Viscari as the person who... Lauren. Yes. File it. Lauren filed it at 9:27 from his office terminal, while Damien stood at the window looking at the Midtown skyline and thought about a storage unit in Greenpoint and a safe deposit box on 47th Street and a key on a chain that a woman had worn against her skin for 11 months while people walked across the floor above her head. He went to the bank first. The box was registered to a name Serafina had told him after he came back upstairs for 30 seconds before leaving. She had said it quietly and quickly, like something being released rather than communicated. The name of a college roommate she had trusted long before the Caldwells had reason to erase her connections. The safe deposit key led him into a private room where the box contained one item, a standard envelope sealed with a small key inside and no other markings. He took it and left. The storage facility in Greenpoint was the kind of place that existed at the functional edge of neighborhoods. The block where residential gave way to light industrial, where the buildings were wide and low and the signage was utilitarian, and the people moving in and out were focused on their own business in the way that made them reliable neighbors of the incurious variety. Unit 14 was on the ground floor at the end of the second corridor. The key worked. The door rolled up. Inside, 2 cardboard boxes, both sealed with tape, both labeled in handwriting he didn't know with nothing but dates. The dates were from 2 years ago. He carried them to the car. Victor drove back to the penthouse without being asked. Serafina was sitting at the kitchen table when they returned, still in the same position essentially, though she'd eaten more of the food and the coffee cup had been refilled. Mira had left an hour earlier with instructions and a contact number, and the completed documentation that Lauren was now cross-referencing with the filing. Serafina looked at the boxes when Damien set them on the table. She didn't say anything. He cut the tape on the first box. Inside, layered in clear plastic sleeves, were physical ledger pages, photocopied, not originals, organized by year and subdivided with paper clips. The handwriting on the ledgers was the precise, compressed script of a man who had been keeping records for decades and had developed a personal shorthand that existed somewhere between bookkeeping and code. Numbers, dates, names in abbreviated forms, amounts that at first glance looked like they could be legitimate business accounting, and at second glance, with the accompanying cross-reference sheets that Serafina had clearly added herself, became something else entirely. He didn't speak while he went through it. She didn't explain. She had spent a long time with this material and understood it at a level that didn't require narration, and she also understood, he thought, that he needed to encounter it on his own terms before they talked about it. He found his father's name on page 47 of the fourth ledger section, not just once, 7 times across a span of 14 months, in entries that documented not the federal testimony itself, that was the public record, but the arrangement that had preceded it, the specific negotiation between Thomas Caldwell and the federal prosecutor's office, the things Thomas had offered, the things he had received in return, and alongside those entries, a separate column of figures that represented payments made to 2 individuals identified only by initials. Initials that Damien, who had spent 6 years reconstructing the architecture of his father's destruction, recognized. One of them was a man who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. The other was still alive, still working. Still, as of 18 months ago, when Damien had begun his preparation, still in a position that gave him access to federal case files. Damien set the page down on the table. He sat with it for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the morning was clear now, the rain gone, the city running in the flat, bright light that followed storms. "You knew," he said. Serafina looked at him. "Serafina, you knew what was in here about my father before you told me the ledgers existed," he said. "You made the calculation. What it would mean to me, whether it was leverage or whether it was bait." "Yes," she said, no hesitation. And I decided it was neither," she said. "It's information. What you do with it is your business. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't know it was there." He looked at her for a long time. "The initials," he said. "BR. Do you know who that is?" She was very still. "I have a guess," she said. "Tell me." "I'm not certain." "Tell me anyway." She looked at him, and then looked at the page in front of him, and then looked at something that was not in the room. The particular focus of someone who is deciding whether to step off a ledge they've been standing on the edge of for a long time. "Benjamin Rourke," she said. The name hit him somewhere specific, not in the chest, lower, in the stomach, in the place where physical reactions to unbearable information tended to land before the mind caught up with them. Benjamin Rourke had been Marcus Viscari's attorney for 19 years. He had been the man in the room for every significant legal decision the Viscari organization had made in nearly 2 decades. He had been the person Marcus trusted most in the legal architecture of his operation. Not a criminal attorney in the sense of someone who defended people at trial, but a structural architect, someone who built the frameworks that kept everything at a legal distance from the people who ran it. He had been the first person Damien had called when Marcus was arrested. He had wept on the phone. He had attended the funeral. He was currently one of 3 people who knew the full scope of Damien's plan for his return to New York. Damien stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides and breathed. Not performing calm, actually working at it, the deliberate mechanical act of breathing when the thing happening in the chest was not calm and required management to prevent it from becoming something that broke furniture. Benjamin Rourke. 19 years. He heard Serafina behind him, the small sounds of her presence, the cup being set down, the shift of weight on the chair. She didn't speak. She was giving him the space that she seemed to understand, instinctively or from some parallel version of the same experience, that a person needed when the ground changed under them without warning. "How sure are you?" he said. His voice was even. That cost him something. "The initials match. The amounts in those entries match figures from the Viscari organization's legal billing records for the same period. I cross-referenced them. I can't tell you it's a certainty. I can tell you that if I were a prosecutor, this would be enough to open an investigation. But not enough to act on immediately." "No." He turned around. She was watching him with an expression that was not pity. She didn't seem to have the architecture for pity, or if she did, she dismantled it a long time ago as a luxury she couldn't sustain. What was in her face was the particular attention of someone who understood exactly how bad the thing she had just told him was, and who was not going to minimize it by pretending otherwise. "When did you figure it out?" he said. "About 4 months into the room," she said. "I had time to think. I knew the initials. I'd seen them across multiple entries over multiple years, and I had tried to work out who they were from context. The amounts, the nature of the payments, what legal service would be worth that much to my father, and why it would be listed separately from the standard counsel line items. She paused. The only answer that fit was someone with direct access to the Viscari legal structure. Someone who could tell my father and Elias when the federal case was building, how to time the testimony for maximum impact, what Marcus would be unable to refute. He knew our defenses, Damien said. Yes. He knew every argument, every piece of evidence we thought we had on our side, every strategy my father's trial counsel was going to use. He said it not to Serafina, but to the room, to the specific air of the room, to the 6 years he had spent reconstructing what had happened and believing he had the shape of it. He handed them the roadmap. Yes. The word landed like something being finalized, like a door being closed that couldn't be reopened. He had come to New York knowing who had betrayed his father. He had spent 6 years building the case against the Caldwells, arranging the architecture of their collapse, planning each stage of their dismantling with the cold precision of a man who has turned grief into engineering. He had been certain of his intelligence, certain of the picture. He had been looking at the wrong frame. The Caldwells had been the executioners, but someone had handed them the weapon and told them where to aim. Someone who had sat across from Marcus Viscari for 19 years and eaten at his table and held his hand in a hospital waiting room when his wife had surgery and cried at his funeral with what Damien had taken, without question, for genuine grief. He picked up his phone. He called Rourke's office. The assistant answered on the second ring. Benjamin Rourke's office. It's Damien Viscari. I need him now. A pause. Mr. Viscari, Mr. Rourke is in a... Now, he said. Another pause. The sound of a hand over a receiver, muffled exchange, then Rourke's voice. Warm, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where voices were tools. Damien, I was going to call you this morning. I heard about the filing. Lorne's office reached out. Where are you? Damien said. At the office, Don't move, he said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call. Victor was already at the door. The drive to Rourke's office in Midtown took 14 minutes. Damien sat in the back seat with the cross-reference page from Serafina's ledger, copies folded in his interior coat pocket, and he did not look at his phone and he did not speak. He thought about the 19 years. He thought about specific moments, specific rooms, specific conversations. The night before Marcus's arrest, when Rourke had called to say he'd heard something concerning from a contact and wanted to meet in the morning, and Marcus had said morning would be fine, and by morning there were federal agents at the door. The convenient timing that Damien had attributed at the time to the limits of Rourke's intelligence network, not the possibility that the call itself had been the signal, a way of establishing an alibi of concern. The meeting in the hospital corridor 6 years ago, when Damien, still recovering from the bullet wound, had told Rourke everything he planned to do, every name, every step. Rourke had been nodding, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in his own shorthand. How many of those notes had gone somewhere else? The office building was 40 stories of glass and steel on Park Avenue. The lobby had the particular expensive silence of buildings where the carpets were thick enough to absorb the sound of consequence. He rode the elevator to the 28th floor and walked past the assistant who stood up and said something he didn't register and pushed open the door to Rourke's office. Rourke was behind his desk. 64 years old, silver-haired, heavy-set, the kind of man whose physical presence had always suggested solidity and permanence, a rock of a person, the kind you built things against because they didn't move. He had a coffee cup in front of him and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the practiced expression of a man accustomed to being walked in on by intense people and accustomed to managing them. He started to stand. "Sit down," Damien said. Rourke sat. Damien crossed to the desk and put the folded page on it. He didn't say anything. He waited while Rourke picked it up and unfolded it and looked at it. He watched Rourke's face. For 2 seconds, 3, the expression didn't change. That was what told him. A man who was genuinely confused by a document he'd never seen would show the confusion immediately. The eyes would move differently. The mouth would open with the beginning of a question. What Rourke's face did was hold still, which was not the expression of confusion, but of a man in the first seconds of a calculation about how bad this was and whether there was any version of a response that managed it. Then Rourke looked up. "Where did you get this?" he said. "That's your question. Damien, your question is where I got this." Damien pulled the chair from in front of the desk and sat in it and looked at him. "Not what it is, not why I'm showing it to you, where I got it." Rourke set the page down. He took his glasses off his forehead and folded them and put them on the desk beside the coffee cup and did all of this with the deliberateness of a man buying himself seconds. "It's not what it looks like, though," he said. The sentence was so inadequate for the situation that Damien almost didn't respond to it. He let it sit in the air between them for a moment. "BR," Damien said. 14 months. 14 months of payments from Thomas Caldwell to 2 individuals, and the cross-reference to Vescari organization billing records during the same period puts one of those initials in a place where only 4 people sat. He leaned forward slightly. "You were one of them." The cross-reference is circumstantial. Ben. The name used the way he had used it for 20 years, not formally, not distantly, landed differently now. Rourke heard it land. Something moved across his face. "They came to me," Rourke said. Damien said nothing. "Thomas came to me 2 years before the federal case. He came to me with information about Marcus that I knew was accurate because I had been in the room for the conversations the information came from." He stopped. He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. "He told me that the federal investigation was going to happen regardless, that there was nothing I could do to stop it, that the question was whether Marcus went down alone or whether other people went down with him." "Other people," Damien said. "He meant me." Rourke's voice was flat. "I had exposure, Damien. Not from Marcus's operation, from things I had done independently, years before, work I did for other clients. Thomas had documentation. He had been building a file on me for 5 years before he ever approached me. That's who Thomas Caldwell is. He doesn't ask for a favor. He constructs a prison and then offers you a key if you do what he needs. So you gave him my father." "I gave him." Rourke stopped. He put both hands flat on the desk. "I gave him what he needed to time the federal approach correctly. I didn't testify. I didn't appear in any proceeding. I provided information about the defense strategy, and I told him when Marcus would be most exposed, and my father went to prison and died there," Damien said. The room was very quiet. Rourke's hands were flat on the desk, and he was looking at them. "Yes," he said, the word with no scaffold around it. Damien sat in the chair and did not move. He had walked into this room believing, in the part of himself that still stored things as facts rather than suspicions, that there would be an explanation, that the initials would turn out to be someone else, that the cross-reference would have a gap, an alternative reading, something that preserved the 19 years as what they had appeared to be. Some part of him had needed that to be true. It was not true. "You've been in contact with the Caldwells since I returned," Damien said. Not a question. Rourke's hands didn't move. "Ben," he said. "Yes," Rourke said, barely audible. "How much have you told them?" Rourke looked up. His eyes were doing something Damien had never seen in them in 19 years. Not quite fear, something more corroded than fear, the expression of a man who has been living with a specific weight for a long time and has just had it become visible to someone who has the power to define what it means. "The filing," Rourke said. "The Greenpoint location. I didn't know about that, I swear to you. I didn't know about the storage unit or the copies." "But you told them about Serafina," Damien said. "I told them you had found someone in the house." "I didn't know who she was when I told them. I found out from—" "You told them last night," Damien said, "after I called you from the car." Rourke was silent. "I called you from the car," Damien said. "I told you I was taking someone to the Midtown property. I told you to have Mira's number ready. You were the only person I called who knew both pieces, that I had someone and where I was taking them." He stood up. Rourke stood up too, instinctively, the way people stand when they feel a situation closing around them, as if vertical was safer than horizontal. "They know where she is," Damien said. Not a question. the sentence arriving in him with the specific weight of things that have already happened and cannot be reversed. His phone rang. Victor. He answered it. The Midtown property, Victor said. And his voice had the particular quality it only had in emergencies, stripped of everything except information. Someone called in a welfare check. NYPD is at the door. Not Caraway's people to local precinct, but the call came in from a number that traces to a Caldwell family attorney. Mira. She's gone. She left before they arrived. Serafina is still there. Don't let them in without a warrant. I'm not there, Victor said. I'm with you. Petrov and Costa are on the door, but they're 2 men, and there are 4 officers. And if they push, how long do we have? Minutes. If they push and Petrov holds them, it becomes a confrontation with NYPD, and we lose that no matter how it resolves. If they don't push and go for a warrant, we have an hour, maybe less, given the family's judicial contacts. Damien looked at Rourke. Rourke was looking back at him with the face of a man who understood what he had done and had no argument left for what came next. I need to fix this, Rourke said. Tell me what I can do. You can't fix this, Damien said. He was already moving toward the door. Damien. Rourke's voice and something in it broke through. Not because Damien trusted it anymore, but because it was 20 years of something real underneath everything that had been built on top of it, and even demolished buildings had weight. They're going to take her back. If they get her out of that apartment and back into a facility they control. I know, Damien said. She'll disappear again. This time they'll make sure. I know, he said. He went through the door and down the hallway, and he did not look back at Benjamin Rourke, standing in the office with his hands at his sides, and the photograph of Marcus Vescari still sitting in the frame on the credenza behind his desk, where it had sat for 6 years because Damien had seen it there before, and had never once thought to question what it meant that the man who had destroyed Marcus kept his image close. In the elevator, he called Victor. Get Petrov to stall, he said. Any way that doesn't escalate. Tell him to cite the medical equipment. Make them wait for a supervisor who needs to authorize entry into a space with an active medical setup. That buys us something. How much do you need? 15 minutes. He came out of the building onto Park Avenue and got into the car, and Victor was behind the wheel. He'd gotten there somehow in the time it took to ride the elevator down, which was the kind of logistical efficiency that Damien had never asked Victor about and never intended to. They drove. Rourke, Victor said. Yes. How bad? Everything I planned for the last 18 months, Damien said. He knew the shape of it, not all the details, but enough. Victor was quiet for a block. The Caldwells knew we were coming, Victor said. They knew the broad strokes. They didn't know about Serafina. He says he didn't know who she was when he told them I'd found someone. I believe that part. He thought about it. But they've had 18 months to prepare for my return, and they've been using what Rourke gave them to do it. The facility documentation, the federal contacts, the welfare check. That was pre-built. They had that ready, and they needed a trigger to deploy it. Ronan going to the feds was the trigger. Yes. Then Ronan going to the feds might have saved her. Damien looked out the window. For approximately 40 minutes, he said. The penthouse building appeared ahead. There was a patrol car on the street and 2 officers on the sidewalk in front of the entrance, and the doorman was outside looking uncomfortable in the way doormen looked when their professional neutrality was being tested by forces larger than it was designed for. Damien got out of the car. He walked to the building entrance. One of the officers stepped forward. Young, doing the job. No particular investment in the specific situation beyond the call that had come in. Sir, we've received a welfare inquiry for this address regarding a... I'm aware, dies, Damien said. I own the property. The individual you're inquiring about is under private medical care. Her physician was here this morning and can confirm her status. We'll need to make visual confirmation that the individual is... You'll need a warrant, Damien said, and I'll need that warrant reviewed by my attorney before I permit access, which is your right to obtain and my right to require. He met the officer's eyes, not threateningly, factually, the language of process used by someone who knew it well enough to not need to raise his voice. You can call for a supervisor. I'll wait. The officer looked at his partner. They called for a supervisor. Damien went inside. He rode the elevator with the number Victor had given him running in his head. 1 hour, maybe less. And he thought about what an hour meant. An hour before a judge the Caldwells had purchase on signed something that gave the welfare check the legal weight to become a forced entry. An hour before the pre-built facility documentation became active, and the story of Serafina Caldwell as a mentally ill patient taken by force from her treatment environment became the version that a courtroom had to engage with first before any other version could get traction. The apartment door opened before he knocked. Serafina was standing in the entry in the clothes Mira had brought her, with her shoes on and her IV removed. She had removed it herself. He saw the tape adhesive still on her inner arm, and she was looking at him with an expression that told him she had heard the officers arrive downstairs through some channel of attention that people developed when they had spent 11 months listening for footsteps above their ceiling. "They're here for me," she said. "They're downstairs. We have time." "How much?" "Less than an hour." She looked at him. Something was working in her face. Not panic. Never panic with her, but the cold, rapid processing of someone whose entire survival history had been built on the ability to assess a deteriorating situation and identify the next viable position. "The filing," she said, "went through this morning." "Is there a judge they don't have?" "Lorne is working on it." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it's not." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, through the apartment windows, the city was fully bright now. The last of the morning haze burned off, everything visible and hard-edged and indifferent. "They're going to use the hour," she said. "They're going to use it to get ahead of the filing, to find someone who can stay any action on the medical documentation until their version of the record is established." "Yes. If I'm back in their custody before Ronan's statement is on record formally, I know. Damien." The first time she had used his name, he registered it and didn't show that he had. "If they get me back, they won't put me in a basement this time. They'll put me somewhere that looks like what they say it is. Somewhere with actual staff and actual documentation, and a version of me in the records that I won't be able to argue against because everything I say will become evidence of the condition they're claiming I have." She was absolutely right. He looked at her standing in the entry of the apartment with her shoes on and her arm bare where the IV had been, and her gray eyes steady. And he understood that he was looking at a woman who had spent 11 months in a concrete room preparing for exactly this moment. Not the rescue, not the safety, not the after, but this moment, the one where safety turned out to be temporary and the next move had to be made before the window closed. "I know a place," he said. "Outside the city, an hour and a half. They can't touch you there. Not legally, not with the people they have access to. And while you're there, Lorne fights the filing, Ronan's statement goes on record, and Mira's documentation becomes the medical record of reference." He said it cleanly. "It takes days, not hours. But the days have to exist first." She held his gaze. "And if something goes wrong," she said, "between here and there." He didn't answer immediately, because something was already wrong. Rourke had given the Caldwells the shape of his operation for 18 months, which meant the routes he would use, the properties he would turn to, the people he would call, all of it mapped. The place he had just described, the property an hour and a half outside the city, was on that map. He picked up his phone and called a number he had not called in 6 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, female, older, carrying the specific flatness of someone who had built a life predicated on not being surprised by anything. "Damien Vescari," the voice said. "Nadia," he said, "I need a favor." A pause. "After 6 years," Nadia said, "you call me for a favor." "Yes." "It must be bad." "It is." Another pause, longer. "Come then," she said. "But Damien, if you bring trouble to my door that I haven't been warned about—" "I'm warning you now," he said. "It's the kind that doesn't announce itself." Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 1 hour, and ended the call. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at Serafina. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." Through the service exit, There's a car in the garage below this building that isn't registered to anything connected to me. Victor drives. She didn't ask questions. She picked up the small bag that Mira had assembled for her. Practical, minimal, the overnight logic of a woman who had learned to move with what she could carry. And she walked to the door. He followed. In the stairwell, descending, he heard his phone buzz. He looked at it. Lorne. He answered it. "The filing," Lorne said, and his voice had the quality that Damien had heard in it only twice before in 11 years, the quality of a man delivering damage. It was rejected. Emergency stay, signed 40 minutes ago by Judge Horace Pettiford. The Caldwell family's counsel filed a counter-motion claiming the filing itself constitutes interference with an ongoing welfare proceeding and potential medical negligence. They argued that removing a patient from legitimate psychiatric care constitutes an actionable harm and that any documentation generated in that context is fruit of an illegal act. Damien stopped on the stairs. "Pettiford signed it," he said. "In 40 minutes, Lorne said, which means it was drafted before our filing was submitted. They anticipated us." Rourke, Damien thought, not the specific content of the filing. Rourke hadn't known that, but the timing. The fact that a filing was coming. That had been enough for Thomas Caldwell to have his counter ready before the original move was made. "Can you appeal?" "Yes, but Pettiford's stay holds during appeal, which means the filing is frozen," Damien said, "and they have legal cover to pursue the welfare check. For now." Serafina was 2 steps below him on the stairs, looking up, listening. She had heard enough. He watched her face absorb it. The specific stillness of someone for whom bad news had long since ceased to produce visible disruption, because visible disruption was a resource she'd learned not to waste. "How long is the appeal?" he said. "If I push every available mechanism, 3 days minimum, possibly 5. "Get it moving," he said. "Now." He ended the call. They stood in the stairwell, the 2 of them, in the fluorescent half-light of a space designed for emergency egress, and currently serving as the narrow margin between one situation. The stairwell door hit the garage wall and they were moving. Victor had the car running, not the SUV. A gray sedan, 4 years old, the kind of vehicle that existed in such quantity on New York streets that looking for it was like looking for a specific drop of water in a river. Damien got Serafina into the back and got in beside her, and Victor pulled out of the garage before the door behind them had finished closing. "Which exit?" Victor said. "West side. Take the surface streets until we're past 40th, then decide." Victor drove. No response, no confirmation, just the wheel turning and the car moving and the particular competence of a man who had been in enough situations like this that his body did the work without requiring his mind to narrate it. Damien looked at the side mirror. The street behind them was clear. That meant nothing. Clear streets in Manhattan meant the car you were worried about was 2 blocks back in parallel, moving through a grid, waiting for you to commit to a direction. He thought about who knew they were leaving. Rourke knew the Midtown property. He didn't know about Victor's garage car. That was 3 layers below what Damien had ever shared with him. He didn't know about Nadia. The Caldwells, working from what Rourke had given them, would have the property addresses that were connected to Damien's operation. They would have names. They would have patterns. They would not have Nadia, because Nadia was not a pattern. She was a relationship that predated everything, that existed in no file and no record that anyone in the Caldwell circle would have had reason to look for. That was the only card he had left that hadn't been seen. "They're going to move fast," Serafina said. She was looking straight ahead, not out the window. "Once they know we're not in the building." "Yes." "Elias will call in the judicial contact. The stay becomes an active warrant, not just a filing block, but a pickup order with her name on it." "Lorne is fighting the stay. For 3 days minimum," she said. Not bitterly, just accurately. 3 days is a long time to be a named subject in an active warrant. He looked at her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the angle of her cheekbones, more visible than they should be, the result of 11 months of systematic deprivation. "Do you trust the copies?" he said. She turned to look at him. "What I mean is, if the copies get to the right people before the warrant is fully active, before the Caldwell legal infrastructure has time to preemptively discredit them, Ronan, she said. Ronan has the digital records. You have the physical ledgers. Together, those are two independent chains of documentation for the same set of facts. He held her gaze. We don't need the court to move in the next 3 days. We need the story to move. She understood what he meant. He saw it in the slight shift of her expression. Not agreement yet, but the engagement of a mind that had been running the same calculations and had arrived, from a different starting point, at the same proximity. You mean press? She said. I mean the right press. Not tabloid. Investigative. Someone with the reach to make the story of the ledgers the first thing a judge reads in the morning before he rules on anything the Caldwell attorneys have filed. That takes a source, she said. A credible one. Not me. They've already built the narrative that discredits me. Not you. A Vescari-sourced story about the Caldwells is a mob war story, not a crime story. Ronan, he said again. She was quiet. He went to the feds voluntarily, Damien said. He has no criminal record. He is a current member of the family with direct access to the digital records. If Ronan speaks publicly, he might not survive that, she said, the words flat and specific. You understand that? If Elias decides that Ronan talking is an existential threat, I know. He's my brother, she said. He put me in that room. He also sat with the guilt of it for 11 months and walked into a federal building this morning. Both of those things are true. I know that too. She looked out the window for a moment. The city moving past. A bodega, a laundromat. A man walking a dog in the flat morning light with the uncomplicated purposefulness of someone who was only trying to get to the end of the block. Where's Ronan now? She said. Still in the federal building as of 40 minutes ago. Call him. He looked at her. I'll talk to him, she said. Not you, me. Her voice was still rough, still carrying the texture of 11 months in recycled air, but there was something in it that he was recognizing more clearly now. A register of authority that had nothing to do with volume. He won't do anything for you, he'll do something for me, or he won't do it at all. He thought about it for 3 seconds. Then he found the number. Ronan Caldwell's cell, acquired through the same process as Elias's, and handed his phone to her. She held it for a moment, then dialed. 4 rings. Then, a voice, male, younger than Elias, carrying the specific texture of a person who had been awake for a very long time and had recently done something that could not be undone and was still processing the dimensions of it. Who is this? Ronan said. It's Sarah, she said. The silence on the other end had a quality that Damien could feel even from a foot away. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of 11 months of a specific weight that had been distributed unevenly between 2 people, the one who carried it in a basement and the one who carried it in every ordinary room of an ordinary life and could not put it down and could not stop walking. Sarah, the word barely there. I'm out, she said. I'm with someone. I'm okay, or I will be. Her voice was even. She was not going to give him a release. Not yet. Not for free. I know you went to the feds this morning. Yes. I know what you brought them. I brought everything, he said. Every file I had access to. I'm sorry it took... Ronan? She stopped him. Don't apologize to me on the phone. There isn't time. She looked straight ahead. I need you to talk to someone else today. Not the feds. A journalist. Someone I'll name and you'll contact directly, and you'll give them what you gave the feds. The digital records. Your account of what the family has been doing. Everything. A pause. Including what they did to me. Silence. If I do that publicly, Ronan said. Elias, yes, she said. Sarah, you know what Elias... I know, she said. I know exactly what Elias does. I've had 11 months to think about it. She was very still in the seat beside Damien. The question is whether you do this now, while there's still noise and momentum, and Damien Vescari's attorney has a filing in the system, or whether you wait and see what the family's lawyers do to the federal statement and whether you decide that was enough. She stopped. You know what waiting looked like the last time. Another silence. Longer. Who's the journalist? Ronan said. She looked at Damien. He wrote a name on the back of a receipt from his coat pocket. She read it. She gave Ronan the name and a number and told him to make contact within the hour and to use his own phone because hiding at this point was not a strategy, and then she ended the call and handed the phone back to Damien. She said nothing. He said nothing. They rode in silence through the Midtown Tunnel and out into Queens and then onto the expressway moving east, and the city began to thin on either side. The compressed vertical density, giving way to the horizontal spread of neighborhoods that had more sky in them, and then further east to the transition zones where the city was still asserting itself but less convincingly, where warehouses and highway infrastructure and the occasional field began to interrupt the continuous built fabric. 40 minutes out, Victor said, "We have a tail." Damien looked at the mirror. Dark blue sedan, 2 cars back, maintaining distance with the specific discipline of a vehicle that was following rather than traveling. "How long?" he said. "Since the expressway." "Not NYPD." "No. Private. 2 men visible from the rear." Damien looked at the mirror for a moment. The blue sedan maintained its gap with a precision that was practiced. This was not reactive surveillance. Someone hadn't spotted them leaving the garage and improvised. This was a car that had been positioned and waiting, which meant Rourke had given them more than the property addresses. He had given them the car, not Victor's garage car. Rourke hadn't known about that, but he had known, apparently, about Victor himself, about the likelihood that Victor would acquire a vehicle, about what Victor's vehicles tended to look like. "Exit," Damien said. "Next one. Don't signal, take it at the last second." Victor took the exit. The blue sedan took it too, losing its gap for 3 seconds in the execution and then recovering. Good driver, not great. The slight delay telling Damien that the following was being done by professionals but not the best ones, which was information. They came off the exit into a commercial strip. Gas stations, a truck depot, a diner with a parking lot that was mostly empty. Victor looked in the mirror. Damien looked at the road ahead. "Pull into the truck depot," Damien said. "Far end." Victor pulled in. The blue sedan slowed on the road and then pulled into the gas station across the street, parking at the pump and not getting out. "They're waiting for us to move again," Victor said. "I know." Damien looked at the time. "Call Petrov. Tell him to bring the other car. Not to this location, to the Route 25 interchange. He knows it." Victor made the call. Damien got out of the sedan. Serafina got out too because she was apparently not a person who waited in cars while other people resolved situations, which he had begun to understand was simply a characteristic of her and not a choice she was making in this specific instance. He looked at her. "Get back in." "There are 2 of them," she said. "Across the street." "I know." "Do you know who sent them?" "I know who enabled them," he said. "The specific contract is Caldwell. The Caldwells have used independent contractors for physical work for years, men who aren't on any family payroll and who can be disavowed. They're not here to hurt me," she said. "They're here to take me somewhere." "Yes. So you're not going to hurt them either." He looked at her. "I wasn't planning on it." "Okay." She looked across the street. The 2 men in the sedan were visible through the glass, both watching, neither moving yet. "Then what are we doing?" "Waiting for a different car," he said, "and making them commit to a move before we do." She stood beside him in the truck depot lot, with the morning sun coming at a low, hard angle from the east, and the smell of diesel in the air, and the sound of the expressway behind them, continuous and indifferent. 4 minutes. Then the blue sedan's doors opened. Both men got out. They walked across the road with the deliberateness of men who had decided that waiting was no longer the play. Perhaps a call had come in, perhaps a deadline had shifted. Perhaps someone in the Caldwell legal machinery had gotten a piece of paper signed that changed the calculus from surveillance to action. They were big men, professional in their movement, not aggressive yet, but carrying themselves in the way that people carry themselves when they are prepared for aggression to become necessary and have made peace with that in advance. Victor stepped forward from beside the car. The man on the left stopped. He recognized Victor the way men in this business recognized each other. The specific register of reading another professional and assessing the distance between you and the outcome you want. "We're here for the woman," the man said. "No one has to." Victor hit him. Not telegraphed, not preceded by anything that would have served as a warning to someone paying attention. A single economical movement that covered the distance between them and connected with the side of the man's jaw before the sentence had a chance to finish itself. The man went sideways and caught himself on the car behind him and didn't go down, which told Damien he was solid enough to be a problem, and then Victor was already moving to keep the angle wrong for the recovery. The second man moved toward Damien. He was bigger than Victor's man, broader, and he moved with a directness that prioritized speed over subtlety. His hand came out at shoulder height, a grab rather than a strike, trying to get control of Damien's coat and use the size differential to put him against the car. Damien stepped left and let the grab miss and used the man's forward momentum against him. A redirection rather than a collision, the principle being that you don't fight the size if you don't have to, you fight the direction. The man's own weight took him forward, and his hand hit the car door and he made a sound. Not pain, but frustration, the specific vocal register of someone whose first move has failed. He turned fast. Damien hit him once, hard, in the solar plexus. The man folded. Not down, but bent. The involuntary collapse of the diaphragm. The 3-second window where the body is entirely occupied with the business of trying to remember how breathing works. Damien took his phone. Standard. Call log. Recent contacts. One number called 3 times in the last hour. He photographed the screen and put the phone in his own pocket. Victor had the first man pinned against the car by the simple method of having one forearm across his chest and the rest of his body serving as a wall. "Who hired you?" Damien said. The man Victor was holding looked at him with the particular expression of a professional who was calculating whether the person asking the question was the kind of person who would hurt him significantly if he didn't answer. He made the calculation and apparently decided the answer was yes. "Attorney named Crane," he said. "Called this morning, said it was a welfare retrieval for a medical patient." "Crane is a Caldwell family attorney," Damien said. No response needed. The man's expression confirmed it. "The woman is not a medical patient," Damien said. "She was held illegally for 11 months. If you take her anywhere, you become part of that." He held the man's eyes. "I want you to think very carefully about whether Crane told you that, and whether the money he offered accounts for what that means legally." The man was quiet. "Your call," Damien said. "Victor." Victor stepped back. The man straightened. He looked at Damien. He looked at Serafina, who was standing 8 feet away with her arms at her sides, and her expression containing the exact amount of feeling she had decided to show, which was none. "We're done here," the man said. "Good choice," Damien said. Both men went back to the blue sedan. It pulled out of the gas station and drove away. Victor watched it go. "They'll call it in." "I know. We need to move." He looked at the time. Petrov would be 12 minutes out. "The number on that phone, I need it traced." "Give me the phone." Damien handed it to him. Victor had a contact for this. A woman who worked in telecommunications infrastructure and who could find the account registration for a number in the time it took most people to decide whether they wanted to make a call. Serafina was looking at him. "You let them leave," she said. "They were contractors. They didn't know what they were hired into." He met her eyes. "I don't have a reason to destroy men who were given wrong information and made a bad decision when they got better information." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between evaluation and something more personal that she was not going to name. "Okay," she said. Petrov arrived in 11 minutes. A different car, older, a truck actually, the kind used for landscaping or light hauling, entirely invisible in the suburban to rural transition zone they were now in. They transferred and Petrov drove and Victor stayed with the sedan to manage the blue car problem if it circled back. The truck smelled of cut grass and gasoline and was surprisingly comfortable in the way utilitarian things sometimes were. No pretension, no performance, just structure serving its purpose. Serafina sat in the middle of the bench seat, Damien on her right, Petrov driving with the silence of a man who understood that his job was the driving. His phone rang. "Lorne." "The appeal is moving," Lorne said. "But Damien, Pettiford's stay has been broadened. 40 minutes ago, he added a provision authorizing law enforcement assistance in locating the subject of the welfare proceeding. That's not standard. Someone walked that provision through his office personally." Which makes it active law enforcement involvement, Damien said. Not just a civil matter. Yes. Which means if local police find her before the appeal resolves, the civil medical framing becomes operative before any criminal evidence can be heard. They can place her in the facility, and then the burden shifts to her to prove she doesn't belong there, which, with their documentation, how do we get ahead of it? Ronan's statement needs to be on formal record before end of business today. If his federal statement is on record and his documentation is logged, any civil placement becomes immediately challengeable because there's an open federal inquiry that creates a conflict of jurisdiction. Damien looked at the road ahead. The landscape fully rural now, trees on both sides. The specific flatness of Long Island giving way to something that felt, at least marginally, like the world having more room in it. Ronan is talking to a journalist, he said. A pause. That's, Lorne chose his words. That's a combustible addition to a filing strategy. It's a parallel strategy, Damien said. The filing strategy was compromised. By whom? I'll explain later. He ended the call. Serafina had been listening with the window-focused attention of someone who was processing by not appearing to process. Rourke told them about the filing timeline, she said. Not a question. Yes. Is Rourke going to be a problem for us going forward? Damien looked at the road. No. She didn't ask why. She accepted the certainty of the word and moved past it. Ronan's statement needs to be formal by tonight, she said. Yes. Then we need to get to him, not by phone. She turned to look at him. Elias knows he went to the feds. By now, Elias has people watching the federal building. Ronan comes out of there tonight with only a phone call between him and a journalist who hasn't published anything yet, and he is genuinely at risk. Damien thought about Elias Caldwell. He had studied the man in the 18 months of preparation with the specific attention he gave to everything he intended to dismantle. Learned his habits, his relationships, his decision patterns, the specific calculus of how he assessed threat, and what he did when he identified something as existential rather than manageable. Elias had shot at Serafina in a hotel hallway. That was the event in the outline she had sketched for him in the early hours of the morning, speaking about the gala, the ballroom, the place where everything was meant to come to a head. But that hadn't happened yet. That was a future that was still being constructed by the decisions being made right now, which meant there was still time to change its shape. But Ronan was in the federal building, and federal buildings had exits, and Elias had resources and motive and the particular ruthlessness of a man who had grown up learning that motive justified any method. Turn around, Damien said to Petrov. Petrov turned around. Serafina looked at him. We're going to the federal building, he said. We get Ronan out before Elias's people do. And then we make sure the statement is on record tonight. All of it. Ronan's, Mira's documentation, and those ledgers. He looked at her. All 3 chains of evidence on record before midnight. At that point, the Caldwells can have every judge they've ever purchased. The federal record has jurisdiction, and there's nothing a civil stay can do about a federal inquiry. She was quiet for a moment. That means you have to walk into a federal building, she said. Yes. Damien Vescari walking into the FBI office in Manhattan. I know what it is. Do you know what it means for you specifically? If they look at who you are and what you've been building for the last 6 years, I know. You'd be handing them a reason to open a separate inquiry into the Vescari organization. I know, he said. The alternative is Ronan comes out of that building without cover, and Elias decides that a dead witness is better than a talking one. He looked at her steadily. I'll take the scrutiny. She looked at him for a long moment. That's not nothing, she said. What you're giving up. No, he said. It's not. The truck covered the ground back toward the city faster than it had coming out, or maybe it just felt that way. The particular compression of time that happened when every minute had specific weight, and you could feel the structure of the remaining hours shrinking as you moved through them. He spent the drive on the phone. Victor first, there was a back entrance to the federal building, a logistics entrance used for equipment and staff, with a contact who could arrange passage without the lobby checkpoint. It would take 30 minutes to set up, and it would cost considerably more than it was worth in raw terms, but raw terms were not the relevant terms today. Then he called a number he had not used in 3 years. A woman named Calloway, who worked for a national publication and who had a track record on organized crime and financial fraud that was unimpeachable. The kind of reporter who published things that ended careers and who had the institutional backing to withstand legal pressure from the people those careers belonged to. She answered on the second ring. "Vescari," she said, like she'd been expecting the call and had decided to be neither surprised nor cooperative as a default position. "I have a source for you," he said, "and documentation, physical and digital. Independent chains establishing 22 years of financial crimes through charitable vehicles, federal case manipulation, and unlawful imprisonment." Silence. "The source's name is Ronan Caldwell," he said. More silence, but a different quality. The silence of someone who has just heard a sentence that requires immediate internal rearrangement. "As in Thomas Caldwell's son," Damien said. "Yes. He's currently giving a statement to federal agents. He'll speak to you directly, tonight, with the documentation in hand. And your involvement in this is what?" "I'm the person making the introduction," he said. "After that, it's between you and Ronan." "Damien," her voice was careful, "if I run this story, it runs with full sourcing. I can't protect you from what's in the documentation if what's in it touches your operation. I understand that." A pause. "All right," she said, "tonight, you set the location." He set the location. A restaurant in Tribeca, where the back room could be reserved without a name, and where the owner was the kind of person who had learned over 20 years that the best thing about not knowing what happened in his back room was not knowing, and ended the call. Serafina had heard all of it. She was looking at him with that expression again, the one that had more texture than calculation, the one he hadn't fully named yet. "You just agreed to let a journalist access the full ledger record," she said, "which includes the documentation about your father." "Yes." "Which includes everything the Caldwells did, but also how they did it, the mechanics, which involves your family name." "Yes," he said, "I know what it involves." She was quiet. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. It was the question she had first asked him in the back of the car, hours ago, in a different version of this day. "What do you want from me?" And he had said nothing, and then not yet. And both of those answers had been honest for what they were at the time. The answer now was different. "Because the other version of this ends with you back in that room," he said, "and I'm not willing to do the math that gets us there." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked away, out the window, at the highway, and the city assembling itself in front of them again. The skyline coming back into view, gray and hard and vast and indifferent, full of people who were running their own calculations about what they were and weren't willing to lose. His phone rang. "Victor." "The number from the contractor's phone," Victor said. "It traces to a personal cell registered to Elias Caldwell." Damien absorbed this. "Elias made the call himself," he said. "Yes, and Damien, there's something else. I had someone watch the Caldwell estate in Westchester overnight. Thomas Caldwell left the property at 6 this morning. He hasn't been seen since. His car was tracked to a parking structure in Midtown, and then the signal drops. Thomas Caldwell, off the grid since 6 in the morning. A patriarch who had decided, somewhere in the course of the night, that managing the situation through legal and proxy channels was no longer sufficient. Damien thought about what that meant. A 71-year-old man who had built a criminal empire over 50 years, who had survived federal investigations and cartel negotiations and family wars, and the specific pressure of maintaining a public face over a private infrastructure for decades. A man like that, when he went dark, was not going home to recover. He was going somewhere with a purpose. "Find him," Damien said, "working on it. Victor. Priority." "I know." The call ended. They were back in the city now, the truck moving through traffic, 20 minutes from the federal building. Beside him, Serafina was very still. She had heard the call. She was doing what she always did, running the numbers. "Thomas going dark," she said. "Yes." "He knows Ronan is talking. He knows the ledger copies are in play. He knows the filing was stayed, but that the appeal is moving." She was looking at her own hands in her lap. "He's not going to wait for the legal process. No. He's going to do what he always does when legal containment fails," she said. her voice very flat. He's going to have someone remove the problem directly. Damien looked at her. Ronan, she said. Or you, he said. She nodded once, the acknowledgement of a fact that she had clearly arrived at already, and was sitting with in the particular way she sat with hard things, completely still, completely present, not flinching from the shape of it. Then we have to get to that building first, she said. Yes. And after Ronan, she stopped, started again. After Ronan is out and the statement is on record and the journalist has the documentation. The gala, Damien said. She turned to look at him. He had been thinking about it since the outline she had described in the penthouse, in the early hours, in the rough shorthand of someone who had spent 11 months planning for the possibility of being able to speak. A charity gala at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The Caldwells attended it annually. It was part of the public infrastructure of their reputation. And it was happening tonight. It was always tonight, because tonight was the one night when Thomas Caldwell would be visible and present and surrounded by the specific witnesses that a public confrontation required. You want to go to the gala, she said. I want to give the Caldwells one chance to see what's coming, he said. Publicly. On record. In a room full of people who matter to them. That's not strategy, she said. It's both, he said. Calloway needs a scene. The ledgers are paper. The story needs a face. If Thomas Caldwell is confronted with his daughter alive and functional in a room full of his peers, in front of cameras, the same night Ronan's statement goes on federal record. It's the same night Elias tried to put a bullet in me in a hallway, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. He looked at her. In the outline, she said. What you read. I was there. I know what happened in that hotel. She was very still. I almost didn't come back from it. I know, he said. So you're asking me to walk back into it. The truck moved through the Midtown grid, 10 minutes from the federal building. Outside, the city doing what cities did. Moving, indifferent, everyone inside their own tunnel of purpose and need, and the specific weight of whatever they were carrying today. He looked at Serafina. I'm asking you if you want to, he said. Not telling you, not deciding for you. She looked out the windshield. If I go to that gala, she said slowly, and Thomas is there, and Elias is there, and Ronan has already put his statement on record, and Calloway has the documentation, then the only move the family has left is the most desperate one. Yes. Elias panics, she said. Yes. And a panicking Elias in a hotel with a gun is the last thing they do, Damien said. Not because I want that outcome, because it's the outcome that ends it. Elias in that room, making that choice, in front of those witnesses, that's not something that can be buried or managed or legally reframed. That's the thing that closes the door on every exit they have left. She was quiet for a long time. The federal building appeared ahead, the wide institutional face of it, the flags, the steps, the stream of people moving in and out. Park, Damien said to Petrov. Petrov pulled over. Damien looked at the building. Somewhere inside it, Ronan Caldwell was in a room with federal agents and 11 months of guilt and a set of digital records that were the most important pieces of documentation in play right now. And somewhere in this city, Thomas Caldwell was moving with a purpose that had gone dark. He opened the door. Then Serafina's hand was on his arm, not grabbing, just resting there lightly, the way you might touch something to confirm it was real. He looked at her. If we do this tonight, she said, the gala, all of it. Her gray eyes held his with a directness that was by now familiar, but still carried something he couldn't categorize cleanly. You understand that when it's over, the Vescari name is in the record. Everything in those ledgers that touches your family, it's public. Yes. And you're choosing that. I'm choosing you not going back into a room, he said. The rest of it is what it is. She held his gaze. Then she took her hand off his arm. Okay, she said. Get Ronan out. He got out of the truck and walked toward the federal building, and the morning sun was fully up now, hard and flat, and casting no shadows because it was too high and too direct for shadows. Everything exposed, nothing sheltered, the whole day. Ronan Caldwell was sitting in a chair against the wall of a third-floor conference room when Damien found him, brought through the logistics entrance by a man named Okafor, who had worked federal building security for 14 years, and who had, over those 14 years, developed the particular philosophy of a person who had seen enough to understand that the law and justice were related but not identical concepts. Ronan looked nothing like his photograph. The photograph Damien had studied during preparation showed a man of 38 with the groomed, managed appearance of someone whose job required presenting a specific face to institutional counterparts. Financial sector confidence, the suit and haircut combination that communicated competence and stability and the absence of anything worth scrutinizing. The man in the chair had not slept and had been crying at some point in the last several hours, which his face still carried evidence of in the specific way that faces carried evidence of things the person couldn't control. The swollen geography around the eyes, the tension in the jaw from holding everything else still while that particular storm moved through. He looked at Damien and then past him, and when he understood that the person behind Damien was Serafina, something happened in his face that Damien looked away from. Not because it was false, it was the most genuine thing he'd seen on a Caldwell's face since he'd entered this whole situation, but because it was private in a way that his presence intruded on. Serafina walked past him. She stopped 2 feet in front of her brother and looked at him for a long moment. He started to say something. She put one hand up, not harshly, just the flat gesture of not yet, and he stopped. They stood there in the conference room with the fluorescent light overhead and the sounds of the building around them. The two of them enclosed in something Damien didn't have a word for. Not forgiveness, not yet, not reconciliation, but some prior stage of those things. The stage where two people who have been on opposite sides of an unbearable fact finally occupy the same room and acknowledge that the fact exists between them and always will. Then Serafina said, quietly, "Are you done talking to them?" "They want me back tomorrow," Ronan said. His voice was wrecked. "For a formal recorded statement. Today was preliminary." "Tomorrow is fine," she said. "Tonight you talk to someone else." She told him about Calloway. She told him about the restaurant, the time, what she needed him to bring. She told him without asking, the way she said things when she had decided they were not negotiable, the register she used that was not demanding but simply definitive. Ronan listened. "Elias knows I'm here," he said when she finished. "I know. I know what he's going to do," she said. "That's why you're not walking out the front door." She turned to Damien. He had already spoken to Okafor about the route out. Ronan left with them through the logistics exit into an alley where Petrov was waiting with the truck, and they drove uptown to the apartment of a woman named Sandra Voss, who was Damien's accountant and who had a second bedroom and a disposition toward not asking questions that had made her professionally invaluable for a decade. Ronan would stay there until the restaurant. Victor would stay with Ronan. Damien gave Victor the address and watched the truck pull away from the curb. He stood on the sidewalk with Serafina beside him. 4 hours, she said. The restaurant meeting was at 8. The gala started at 7. Yes? I need clothes, she said. Not self-consciously, practically. The statement of a woman who understood the logistics of what they were walking into and was treating them as logistics. I know someone, he said. The woman he knew was named Petra, and she ran a consignment operation on the Upper East Side that dealt in high-end garments with the kind of discretion that made her useful to people who needed to appear in places without the preparation time that appearances normally required. She took one look at Serafina, the height, the shoulders, the specific quality of presence that 11 months in a basement had not managed to erode, and disappeared into the back without speaking. She came back with 3 options. Serafina chose without hesitation. Black, structured, the kind of dress that made no attempt to be decorative and was therefore more striking than decoration. She looked at herself in the mirror for 3 seconds and looked away. The assessment completed and filed. In the car afterward, she said, "What do we do about Thomas?" Victor had not found him. As of an hour ago, Thomas Caldwell remained off the grid. No cell signal, no card activity, no sightings at any of his known locations. A 71-year-old man who had built a career on visibility had chosen, for the first time in memory, to be invisible. That meant he was either waiting somewhere or he was already in motion, and both possibilities required different responses. If Thomas is at the gala, Damien said, we handle it in the room. And if he's not, then he's somewhere else doing something worse, he said. And we handle that when it surfaces. She absorbed this. Elias will be there, she said. Elias always goes to the gala. It's where he does business, the legitimate face of the family, the charity performance, the social credit they've been spending for 30 years. She paused. He'll know by now that Ronan is out of the federal building. He'll know the preliminary statement is done. He'll be calculating what's left to salvage. A cornered Elias is... I know what he is, she said. I've known him my whole life. The Grand Meridian Hotel sat on Central Park South like something that had decided it had been there long enough to stop explaining itself. It had the particular confidence of old money architecture. Nothing ostentatious, just the accumulated weight of decades of exactly this kind of event, the ballrooms and the chandeliers and the marble that had absorbed so much of the city's history that it had begun to seem geological. They arrived at 7:40. The gala was in full motion. 300 people in formal attire, moving through the ballroom with the choreographed drift of those who had learned to perform relaxation at gatherings that were fundamentally about something else. Champagne, the low aggregate sound of a room in which many separate conversations were happening simultaneously, the specific atmosphere of a charity event in which the charity was the frame and the networking was the content. Damien saw the moment they entered registered in the room, not dramatically. This wasn't a movie entrance. It was the small sequential recalibration of people who recognized either face or both faces and updated their understanding of the evening accordingly. A woman near the door whose conversation paused for a half second. A man across the room who turned to speak quietly to the person beside him. The information moving through the room in the particular wireless way that information moved through rooms where everyone was paying careful attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing. Serafina walked beside him and did not look at any of it. She was looking for her brother. She found Elias in 12 seconds. He was near the far end of the room by the windows that overlooked the park, holding a glass of something he wasn't drinking, wearing the expression of a man who had been performing ease for 30 years and was currently running that performance on a substrate of something that was not ease at all. He saw her at the same moment. Damien felt her stop breathing for 1 second beside him. Not from fear, from the specific impact of seeing something you've imagined from underground for 11 months suddenly standing in a lit room looking back at you with its own face. Elias set his glass down. He began moving toward them through the room. He moved with a controlled velocity that was not running, but was everything that walking could be made into. A directed, absolute movement toward a fixed point that parted the room in front of him the way a particular quality of intent parts any space it moves through. He stopped 6 feet from them. He looked at Serafina. His face was doing several things simultaneously. The practiced composure still there as a layer, but thinner than it had been, worn down by the day's events to something closer to the actual surface. "You're going to come with me," he said, quietly. For her, not for the room. "No," she said. "Sarah?" "Don't," she said. Same register, same volume. "Don't use that name tonight. Don't stand in this room and use that name like it means something you're entitled to." Something moved across Elias's face. "The statement Ronan gave," he said. "It doesn't mean what you think it means. Our attorneys, Elias." She stepped 1 foot closer to him, which closed the 6 feet to 5, and which was a small movement that nonetheless cost her something. Damien felt it, the deliberate choice to reduce the distance rather than hold it. "I've been in a concrete room for 11 months. There is nothing you can tell me tonight about what your attorneys can do that will make me feel anything other than what I already feel." He held her gaze. "I didn't want it to go that far," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That's the worst part." Elias looked at Damien. His expression shifted. The particular shift of a man who had run the calculations on a situation and understood that the variables had moved beyond his management. "Whatever she's told you," Elias said. "The ledgers are with a journalist," Damien said. "Ronan's statement is on federal record. The medical documentation from the physician who treated her last night is filed with Lorne's office and will be submitted as soon as the stay is appealed." He said it without emphasis, without satisfaction. Just the sequence of facts in the order they had occurred. There's no version of tonight that changes any of that. Elias looked at him. Then he looked back at Serafina. And something, the composure, the management, the 53 years of learning to present only the face that served his purposes, something in it broke. Not loudly, not with tears or a raised voice, just a fracture that showed through the surface the way fractures showed through stone. You couldn't unsee it once it was visible. He reached into his jacket. Damien was moving before the hand completed its arc. He got between them in 2 steps, and Elias's hand came out with the gun, and the barrel swept up towards Serafina, and Damien's hand came down hard on Elias's forearm, redirecting the line, and the gun went off. The sound in the ballroom was enormous. Then the room exploded, not with fire, with the specific human chaos of 300 people in a confined space registering a gunshot simultaneously, the mass movement toward exits, the screaming, the specific sound of dropped glass and overturned furniture, and the aggregate physical expression of 300 people deciding that being somewhere else was the primary imperative. Damien had Elias's wrist. The gun was between them. Elias was stronger than he looked, not from fitness, but from desperation, from the specific force that people produced when they were at the end of every other option, and the only thing left was the physical. The gun came down between them and hit the marble floor and skidded, and Damien let Elias's wrist go and stepped back. Elias stood in the emptying ballroom and looked at his empty hand. Then he looked at Serafina, who was standing 8 feet away against an overturned table with her hand pressed to her left side. Blood. Not the gun. The shot had gone wide, into the ceiling. But a shard of something, a fragment from a glass or a piece of the chandelier that had come down from the impact of the shot in an old room with old fixtures, had caught her along the left ribs. Not deep. He could see that from across the room. Not deep, but real. The dark stain spreading into the fabric of the black dress. Elias made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person made when they understood, in a single moment, the full and irreversible consequence of every choice that had led to the moment they were currently in, the compressed arithmetic of years, arriving all at once. He did not run. He sat down on the marble floor of the emptying ballroom with his hands in his lap, and he sat there. Damien crossed to Serafina. "Let me see," he said. She moved her hand. He looked. Laceration, 3 inches, superficial in depth but bleeding freely in the way that rib area wounds did. "I'm okay," she said. "I know what I need," she said. "Get Elias away from the gun." He looked at her. "Get Elias away from the gun," she said again. "He's going to do something stupid." He looked at Elias sitting on the floor with his hands in his lap, and the gun 10 feet from him, and a room full of phone cameras that had been recording from the moment the shot went off. He walked to the gun and picked it up and put it in his coat pocket. Then he walked to Elias and stood above him. Elias looked up. His face was entirely open now. No management, no performance. Just the face of a 53-year-old man who had done what he had done and was on the other side of it and understood that the other side was where he would remain. "Where's Thomas?" Damien said. Elias looked at him. "Where is your father, Elias?" "He left," Elias said. "This afternoon. I don't know where." He stopped. "He called me from somewhere and told me to handle tonight. He said if the gala went the right way, the whole thing could still be managed." He looked at his hands. He believed that. He actually believed we could still manage it. "But you didn't believe it," Damien said. Elias said nothing. "You came here tonight knowing the ledgers were in play, and Ronan had talked, and the medical documentation existed," Damien said. "You came here anyway. You brought a gun to a charity gala with 300 witnesses because you'd decided the only move left was the most permanent one." He paused. "Why?" Elias looked up at him. "Because she was going to be here," he said. "And as long as she was—" He stopped. "As long as she was alive and functional and speaking," Damien said, "there was no version of the story that the family survived." Elias said nothing, which was the same as yes. Damien looked at him for a moment. There was no satisfaction in it. He had anticipated this. He had needed it to happen this way. Public, witnessed, documented by the phones that were still recording from every corner of the room. He had needed Elias to make the choice himself, in front of the room that mattered most to the family's constructed identity, but needing a thing to happen did not make the thing pleasant to be present for. "There are police in this building now," Damien said. "I'd suggest you stay where you are." He walked back to Serafina. She was standing against the table with her hand pressed to her side, and she was looking at Elias on the floor, and her face had the expression of someone who is looking at a thing they have imagined for a very long time and finding that reality has a specific texture that imagination did not prepare them for. Not softer than expected. Just different. More specific. More human, in the worst way that human meant. "Come on," Damien said quietly. "I want to wait for the police," she said. "I know. I'll have someone bring them to us." He moved closer. "You're bleeding." "I'm aware." Serafina. She looked at him. The gray eyes carrying everything they always carried. The calculation, the precision, and underneath it, what had always been underneath it. The person who had been in that room for 11 months and had kept everything intact through force of will alone, and who was, at this specific moment, very tired. "Okay," she said. He put his arm around her left side to support her without putting pressure on the wound, and they moved toward the side corridor where the hotel staff had already begun clearing the way for emergency access. The police arrived at the ballroom entrance as they reached the corridor. Damien told the first officer exactly what to find. Elias Caldwell, seated, the weapon secured in Damien's coat, which he surrendered immediately, and gave his own name without any version of a cover, and watched the officer's face register it and moved past that and through the corridor to a chair near the service exit where Serafina sat, and he crouched in front of her while they waited for the paramedics. "It's done," she said. He looked at her. Elias in a room full of witnesses with a recorded shot and a wound and the ledgers all ready with Calloway. She was very calm, the calm of someone on the other side of a long, sustained effort. "It's done." "The legal process still takes time," he said. "Yes," she said, "but the shape of it is done. The thing that was going to happen has happened." She looked at him. "My father is still out there." "Yes." "He'll surface," she said. "Men like Thomas always surface. They can't disappear permanently. They're too built into things, too dependent on the infrastructure of their own importance." She paused. "When he does..." "Lorne will be ready," Damien said. "Ronan's statement and the digital records cover Thomas directly. When he surfaces, there's a federal warrant waiting." She nodded once. The paramedics arrived. They were efficient and focused, and one of them made the particular face that paramedics made when a wound was real, but not the worst version of itself. The face of controlled relief, the professional recalibration from worst case to manageable. He stepped back to let them work. He stood in the service corridor of the Grand Meridian Hotel and thought about Benjamin Rourke in his office on Park Avenue with the framed photograph of Marcus Viscari on the credenza. He thought about what he was going to do with that specific piece of the situation. He had not decided yet. Not because the decision wasn't clear. The clear decision was the one that ended Rourke's career and his freedom, the one that filed the ledger evidence with federal authorities and let the process do what processes did. The clear decision was not in question. What remained was something smaller and more private. Whether the 19 years meant anything in the accounting, whether the fact that Rourke had been coerced rather than voluntarily corrupt changed the weight of the outcome or only the cause of it. He didn't know yet. He thought about his father, Marcus Viscari at 63, silver at the temples, hands that had built something from nothing. He thought about what it would mean to Marcus if he could know that the full truth of the arrangement that destroyed him was now going to be public record, that the man who sat across from him for 19 years had been paying a debt to people who had constructed the prison around him, that the betrayal was not simple opportunism, but the more corrosive kind, Sopain, the kind that came from someone who had cared genuinely and then been shown a door out that they chose at someone else's expense. He didn't know if knowing would have made it better or worse. He suspected worse. He suspected Marcus would have preferred the clean version of the betrayal, the mercenary one, the one where the money or the fear was enough explanation and no other layer existed beneath it. He suspected that was not the version he himself was going to be able to use. Thomas Caldwell surfaced 4 days later. Not in New York. in a federal building in Washington, D.C., where he had spent 72 hours consulting with a private attorney who had spent those same 72 hours assessing the full scope of what Ronan had given the government and what Calloway had published. The article had run on the second day, front page, with documentation that the editorial board's lawyers had cleared through an overnight review because it was the kind of material that was either entirely solid or catastrophic. And in this case, it was entirely solid. And who had concluded, at the end of those 72 hours, that Thomas Caldwell's best available option was voluntary surrender with cooperation terms. Thomas was 71 years old. He walked into the federal building in Washington in a suit that probably cost more than Damien's first car, and he was accompanied by his attorney, and he did not look at the cameras. Damien watched it on the news in the penthouse on 54th Street. He was sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Serafina was in the bedroom. The wound had required 8 stitches, and Mira had enforced 2 days of rest with the particular authority of a physician who was also the only person in the orbit whose instructions Serafina seemed willing to actually follow. He turned the television off. He sat in the quiet of the apartment and thought about the fact that it was over. Not over in the sense that the process was complete. There would be months of legal proceedings, testimony, the grinding machinery of federal cases that moved at their own pace regardless of the human urgency that had produced them. But over in the sense that the thing that had been set in motion 19 years ago and that had destroyed his family and consumed 6 years of his life and brought him back to a city in the rain to find a woman in a basement, that chain of cause and consequence had reached its end. He didn't feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected something that resembled resolution, the clean closing of an account. Instead, there was something more like the feeling after a long physical effort, the absence of the effort more than the presence of anything new, the specific emptiness of muscles that have been under sustained tension for so long that relaxation felt like a different kind of pain. He heard the bedroom door. Serafina came out in the clean clothes Mira had left for her, moving carefully on the left side, but not protecting it so much that the movement lost its characteristic directness. She looked at the blank television screen and then at him. "He turned himself in," she said. "Yes." She went to the kitchen and poured water and came back and sat in the chair across from him. Not the couch. The chair, which maintained the distance she had always maintained, the careful geometry of a person who did not default to proximity. They sat in silence for a moment. "Rourke," she said. He looked at her. "You haven't decided," she said. "No." "I think you should file it," she said. "Not for me, for the record. What he did to your father deserves to be in the record." "It does," he said. But filing it means his coercion by the Caldwells becomes part of the public case," he said, "which means his actual culpability gets complicated in public perception in ways that may not reflect the actual weight of what he did. So you want him to face the full weight without the excuse being visible." He looked at her. "Yes." "Then speak to him," she said, "directly, before you file anything. Tell him what you know and what you're going to do with it, and give him the chance to respond without lawyers." She held his gaze. "You gave Elias the chance to respond without lawyers. It ended badly. But you gave it." He thought about this. "You think I owe Rourke the same," he said. "I think you'll need to have had that conversation," she said, "regardless of what you decide, otherwise it stays open inside you." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did you get expert at this?" he said. 11 months in a concrete room," she said. "You think about everything." He called Rourke that afternoon. He went alone, without Victor, to the office on Park Avenue, and he sat across from the man who had been his father's attorney for 19 years and his own confidant for most of his adult life. And he said what he knew. All of it. He said it without raising his voice and without breaking any of the furniture, and when he was done, he looked at Benjamin Rourke and waited. Rourke did not attempt to explain further. He did not revise the account. He sat with his hands on the desk, and he said very quietly, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to file everything," Damien said. "The initials, the cross-reference, Serafina's documentation." Rourke nodded. "Was any of it real?" Damien said. The 19 years." Rourke looked at him. "Yes," he said, the word with nothing around it. Damien stood up. Then that's the cost of it, he said. He walked out. He filed the documentation through Lorne's office that evening. He did not feel better afterward. He felt accurate, which was a different thing and in some ways harder. Accuracy without comfort, the clear view of a landscape after the weather had moved through and left everything precisely visible and not particularly gentle. Rourke's attorney called the following morning to announce that his client intended to cooperate fully. Elias Caldwell was arraigned on multiple charges, including attempted murder, unlawful imprisonment by proxy, and conspiracy. He waived bail. His attorney suggested this was a strategic decision. People who had known Elias for 30 years suggested it was something simpler, that he had been performing his way through every room for so long that the moment the performance became impossible, there was nothing underneath it that knew what to do with open space. Ronan's testimony was clean and complete and broke the digital documentation into pieces that the federal case could build from for the next 2 years. He looked, in the single photograph that made it into the news, like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying badly for a very long time, and who was not relieved exactly, but was done, which was its own specific condition. Calloway's article ran in 2 parts, the first part on the ledgers and the financial crimes. The second part, published a week later after Serafina agreed to be interviewed, was about the 11 months. It ran with a single photograph, Serafina sitting in the chair in the penthouse, looking at the camera with the expression that was by now familiar to Damien and that he had come to understand was not neutrality, but something more considered than that, the expression of someone who had decided exactly how much of themselves to give to any given moment, and was giving precisely that much and not 1 degree more. The article did not mention Damien by name. This was Serafina's request to Calloway, and Calloway had honored it, describing only an unnamed party who had been on the property during a business meeting. He had told Serafina this wasn't necessary. She had said that the story wasn't about him. He had not argued. The weeks after were strange in the specific way that the aftermath of sustained crisis was strange. The machinery of ordinary life reasserting itself around a space that had been occupied by something else. Damien's organization required attention. There were operational matters that had been held in suspension during the crisis that now needed addressing, relationships that needed managing, the ordinary administrative reality of what he ran. He addressed them. He was efficient about it. He found that the clarity he'd operated with during the crisis translated surprisingly well to the routine. The threshold for what constituted an actual problem had shifted, which made the actual problems easier to sort from the noise. He saw Serafina 3 times in the weeks after the gala. Once when she came to the penthouse to collect the remaining ledger copies for the federal case. Once when Lorne required both of them in the same room to review documentation for a deposition. Once when he found her, without having arranged it, standing outside the building that had once housed his father's main office in the Bronx, a building that was now a pharmacy, which was the particular way that time handled the architecture of things that had seemed permanent. She was looking at the building. He stopped beside her. "How did you know this was here?" he said. "It was in the ledgers," she said. "Your father's address was in the records of the arrangement. I memorized it because I memorized everything." She was still looking at the building. "I wanted to see it." He looked at the pharmacy, the signage, the unremarkable facade. "What are you going to do?" he said. "After the deposition, after the legal process is running on its own." She was quiet for a moment. "I had an apartment," she said, "before, on the west side. I don't know if it's been sublet or what's happened to it. I have to sort that out." She paused. "And there was work I was doing before any of this. Research into nonprofit financial structures. I was building toward a report that would have gone to a regulatory body." She stopped. "I'd like to finish it." "Finish it," he said. She looked at him. "I'd like to," she said. "It seems like a reasonable thing to want to do." He looked at the pharmacy. "Yes," he said. They stood there for another minute in the cold, clear air of a November afternoon in the Bronx, in front of a building that had been something else and was now a pharmacy and would be something else again in another decade, the city doing what the city did. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "I know you think about your father," she said. "I know you've been sitting with the question of whether what happened with Rourke and the case and the record, whether any of it is what you came back for. He held her gaze. It's not what I planned, he said. I know. It's more expensive than what I planned. Yes. And the outcome, he stopped. My father still died in a federal prison. That's not changed by a filing or a case or a public record. No, she said. It's not changed. She turned to look at him directly. But you didn't put 3 men in the ground and disappear back to wherever you came from, which is what would have happened without the basement. He looked at her. You saved me too, she said. I know you know that. I just mean, the basement saved us both from worse versions of what we were becoming. He thought about that. About the version of this that would have happened without the sound from under the floor, without the 2 faint impacts that had the wrong rhythm for pipes. About the plan that had been clean and surgical and designed to avoid complications. He thought about how much he would have lost in the execution of that plan. I should have listened harder in more rooms, he said quietly. Something softened in her expression. Not sentiment. She was not a sentimental person, and he did not think she was going to become one. But something warmer than her baseline, something that she allowed briefly and then set aside. You could come to the deposition, she said. Next week. You'll be there anyway. Yes. And after... She stopped. After is after, he said. We'll see what it is. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she put her hands in her coat pockets and turned away from the pharmacy and walked back up the block toward the street. And he stood for another minute looking at the building that had been his father's and thinking about the word after. The specific, uncharted quality of it. The way it contained both the absence of everything that had been and the presence of everything that hadn't happened yet. The 2 things coexisting in a space that had no shape yet because it hadn't been lived into. He walked up the block after her, not running, not calling her name, just walking in the same direction at the same pace through the cold November afternoon in the city that had taken everything from him once and that he had returned to with a plan for destruction, and that had given him instead something he had no clean category for, something that required him to be more careful and more present and more honest than destruction had ever demanded. The city moved around them the way it always moved, indifferent, continuous, full of its own urgency. They turned the corner at the same moment without discussing it, the natural logic of 2 people who had been walking toward the same place for longer than either of them had planned. Behind them, the pharmacy on the corner of the block where Marcus Viscari's office had once been sat in the afternoon light and held nothing and required nothing and was simply there. The way things were simply there after the people who had given them meaning were gone, patient and ordinary, and waiting for the next version of what the world needed it to be.